morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, I want to let everyone know that this event is being recorded through Zoom. So welcome to our fall workshop in podcasting, multi-ethnic digital storytelling, led by Drs. Deepthi Murali and Manamee Guha. I'm Charlotte Barker, co-director of the Digital Humanities Initiative here at UNC. The DHI is a collaboration between the Institute for the Humanities and the University Library. Today's event is part of our brand spanking new multi-ethnic digital humanities project, which is made possible by a grant from the U of I's Presidential Initiative to expand the impact of the arts and humanities. So before I introduce our workshop leaders, I'm going to hand it over to the other co-director of the DHI. I'm also co-director of the DHI, and I'm happy today to participate in this podcasting webinar, which is in a hybrid format. So we'll be doing streaming in here, in person. So please welcome our guests.
Hello. So are you introducing us? Should we introduce ourselves? Is there anything else that we should do?
We can introduce.
Yeah, we can introduce ourselves.
Go for it.
Yes. Hi, welcome to, we are calling it Podcasting for/by academics, just to keep this really,
I guess the mic isn't working.
yeah, okay, great.
Let me see, is it turned on?
Well, okay, why don't you just speak from mine then?
I could just use the other mic, the handheld one.
Okay.
Then, hello, monitoring.
Like tap it. No, it's not working.
That's not working.
Is it?
All right, they say it's better.
Okay.
If you can hear me, yeah, I can see some mic action there. So, hi, I'm Deepthi Murali. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. I work as a digital humanities postdoc, and podcasting is one of the many things that we do at the center. And specifically humanities podcasting. I'm really happy to be back at UIC. I graduated in July. I mean, I defended in July 2020 from the art history program, and then I really technically graduated only in fall 2020. So I'm newly back at UIC, but I've been away for 2 years, so I'm really happy to be back.
Hi, everyone. I'm the other host. My name is Dr. Manamee Guha. Currently, I'm assistant professor of history at Fort Hays State University in a very small town in Northwest Kansas, in Hays. And I teach courses on, I do survey courses on world history, but my specialization is colonialism, British colonialism, especially in South Asia. And I teach courses, and my research interest is more transnational, global historical topics, examined through the lens of colonialism. And I would call myself more of a cultural historian rather than a political or economic historian. And I think both of Deepthi's interest and my interest together, I think, make for really interesting conversations in Masala History that we run as a podcast between the two of us. Then should we go on to talking about Masala History then?
Yeah, but before we do, maybe we can get a moment, if you can, in the chat, tell us something about yourself, like maybe your name, your discipline, and your favorite podcast to get us started, and maybe also let us know. No,
where's your mic?
My mic is here.
No, the handheld mic. That is on.
Okay, checking mic again. So what we're going to do is, if you can use the chat function to kind of tell us a little bit about your name, your discipline,
Favorite podcast.
favorite podcast,
and why, right?
and yeah, and sort of like, why are you here? What do you expect from this workshop?
Yeah. What
So
do you
we'll take a
expect to
couple
get
of
out of
minutes to
it?
do that.
There's a lot of chat already. Oh. Okay. Sure. Oh, we're getting responses. Okay.
Great. Hi, Wendy. Nice to meet you. I like that you listen to a lot of podcasts. That's exactly what we want to hear.
Hi, Jasmine. Literature. Oh, wow.
Oh, where are we?
Do you want to expand it so we can be
Oh,
able
yeah,
to
that
keep
might be.
scrolling?
I think they can also see
Oh.
that.
Okay.
Hi, Jasmine. Literary shorts. That sounds interesting. I do want to listen to that, so I'll go subscribe to your podcast once we're done here. Nashiali, I know Nashiali. She's at she's at George Mason. Hi, Nashiali.
Wow.
Nice to meet you again online. Hi, Kevin. Yeah, I love Radiolab too. It's one of my favorite podcasts. I haven't listened to Rewatchable, so maybe I should put that on my roster.
Latin stories. Wow.
Hi, Zaina. Radiolab is a favorite. Like I think Radiolab is one of those things that kind of really appeal to academics, and it's kind of a good example of public humanities podcasting done by non-academics, non-humanists.
Oh, so it's non-academics taking a perspective on.
It's a variety of things, but they go like in depth into
Oh, okay.
Concepts.
Okay. Hi, Ria. Stuff you should know. Great info and funny. That
Yes,
always helps.
We have a clip. We have a clip from Stuff You Should Know in the presentation. Hi, Miriam.
The interview.
Yes, Reading Women. That's a lovely podcast too. I love Reading Women. And you're launching a podcast, so yay.
Yay.
Hi, Elena. Latin at Stories. Is that your podcast? So if you have a podcast of your own that you make, drop the link so that all of us can share and maybe follow each other.
Yeah.
And that way we can keep track and maybe have a cohort of people who are interested in podcasting, who are in the humanities, who are academics or academic adjacent, and we can build a community that way. So if you have your podcast or you have contact information that you don't mind sharing, please feel free to throw them in the chat.
Hi, Diana. I love listening to true crime podcasts. That's like my guilty pleasure. When I'm done with history, that's when I put on my detective hat and I try to solve crimes in my own head. But
did you? There is a new show on Hulu with
Steve
about
Martin,
this, yeah, with Steve Martin.
Yeah.
That sounds.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Stuff to blow your mind. So what is one of the things you've listened to on Stuff to Blow Your Mind that literally came close to blowing your mind? Would love to hear more about that. And I mean, again, it's a funny story how Deepthi and I got started on Masala History, and I'll tell you about it because that will truly show you how Deepthi was moving ahead of the times with podcasting.
Yeah.
Even before if I'm being perfectly honest, even before I even knew what podcasting was all about.
It took a little bit of strong arming Manamee into doing this with me, so I won't deny.
Yeah, I'm not saying this because she's standing here, but she really was like,
bring it on.
We need to do this. And also there, wow.
So before we get to, so I know that there are some beginners here, but there seems to be some of you who are also already doing podcasts. So just to give me an idea, like if you can also tell me what you're trying to get out of the workshop. So we have a couple of breakout sessions where we are going to do like an idea generation and like a technical portion, but I want to be able to, like, we want to customize it to what you are interested in. So if you can tell me in the chat, like, what do you think you want to get out of this workshop today?
Like one or two things, specific things, so then we can then be more specific in the later half of the
day.
Yeah. So while you guys are typing, so let me tell you the story of how Masala History came about. Is and this would have been 2007. Yeah, yes, 2017. Yeah. So I graduated in 2019. She graduated in 2020. So 2017, starting from, well, it feels like from 2011 when we started the program. But we were at that pivotal moment when you're writing your dissertation. You've just gotten started writing your dissertation, and you thought that was going to be your entire focus, and then you had to be out in the job market, all of these things. And one day she calls me out of the blue and she's like, hey, so do you want to start a podcast? So for a second I was like, huh? And she said, do you want to start a podcast talking about historical topics that you and I both talk about to each other? And so we nerd out on topics, like she will come and tell me something she found very interesting that she knew that many people would not be interested. And so I said, okay. And I said, well, I don't have the time. You don't have the time. We are writing our dissertation, apparently. And, we're out in the job market. We're very busy. We can't do this. And she's like, let's just give it a shot. And so it took some convincing. And then I think you came up with the name Masala History as well. And if you go to our website,
there was wine involved. This was
there was wine involved. I was trying to keep that out of the conversation, but okay, there was a
sometimes good podcasting requires wine, people, like that's
go
there.
for
that's
it,
part of
right.
it.
Or whatever else rocks your boat. Yeah, so there was some amount of wine. She eventually wore me down, and then we
got it out of a menu, actually. We were trying to order Indian food and we saw masala, and then we were like, that's what. So essentially our podcast is about the history of South Asian of the Indian subcontinent and any topics related to it. So that's where we started. And when we started, we wanted history in the name, but we wanted it to be identifiably Indian or South Asian.
Yeah.
And we also wanted it to be a popular enough term that we didn't have to keep on explaining what something meant.
Right.
And we didn't want it to be bland, like South Asia history or something like that. So masala seemed like a catch-all term. Sometimes we get confused for like a food podcast because of it, because masala essentially is the spice. But that's essentially what we think of as Masala History. We're talking about topics that is of really interest to us, and which are like, in Indian terms, we would call masaledar, like, it's like spiced up or of interest.
Spicy and hot, and
or like, something that generates
tingles
like,
your tingles your senses, right?
So, and I think that's lesson 101, which is branding. And I know somebody
asked about,
asked about audience.
How to build an audience,
That's a whole different conversation. And we can briefly get to that in Q&A if you can ask that question again, Wendy. But we won't be looking at growing audience is a multifaceted activity, and it depends on a lot of different factors. So it's like an intermediate level question, and we will sort of get to that at the end in the Q&A. Mark, yes, you're our ideal student.
Audience, yes.
This is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to intro on how to start, what kind of technical stuff you need, what kind of equipment you need, but also on how can you, I think if in one way I had to summarize, it would be, how can you make a podcast knowing that you're all very busy academics who have limited time to work on yet another project? And how can you make that audible, fun, visible,
and interesting to a broader audience. In my case, I work with public podcasting, like public humanities podcasting. I am the producer for PhD Futures Now, which is a podcast from the Humanities Without Walls Consortium, which is headquartered at UIUC, but UIC is part of it. It's a 16 university consortium. And that podcast is about career diversity and talking about career diversity for humanities PhD. So it's a very different podcast from, say, Masala History. And I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. I also work as a producer on an American history podcast at the center at Mason, where I am right now. And that podcast is a history podcast called Consolation Prize, which talks about American consuls in the 18th and 19th century going around the world and doing pretty bad stuff, essentially, and bunkering it up. So there are different kinds of podcasting experience that I have, but it's all sort of public oriented. And so we will talk about audience in a little bit more detail and what type of audience to cater to or design your podcast for in a bit. Isabel says, method of storytelling. Yes, Isabel.
We can talk about
We are going to be talking about that quite a bit.
viability of creating short-run podcasts with a cohort of grad students from different institutions. Yep.
Yep,
Absolutely.
naturally, that's what we did initially with Masala History. So we'll definitely be talking about that.
Best practices for using multiple languages. Yep.
That is actually a really good question about using multiple languages. One of the things, so Masala History is right now in sabbatical, but we are revamping it. We are going to make it more of a, and we'll talk about formats in a little bit, but basically Masala History is revamping so that we can, when we produce, we want to make our podcast accessible to regional centers of South Asia. Most of our listenership comes from the US, but we have a pretty good, like about 30 to 40% are also South Asian listenership that we have for our podcast.
From South Asia.
Yeah, from South Asia. And so when we make a podcast episode that's about a certain historical figure, that's say from the place I am from, India, which is Kerala, and their language is not Hindi or English, but a different language. We want to make that accessible to the people who speak that particular language. So that kind of complexities in podcasting is something that we can talk about, but maybe not in detail because it's sort of like slightly more advanced to talk about that.
Again, to kind of go back to how Masala History came about, I think the first couple of episodes that we did, and we quickly realized that it's not really the format that's working. It was basically, I think you had done one, I had done one of just one of
Scripted,
us just talking. And one of us just, this is during research for dissertation, came upon a topic and, she was excited by what I was going to talk about. I was excited about what she was going to talk about. And so then it was just, it was literally like a monologue of, her, and I can't remember what you had done it on. But we realized that's not really the format, because after a point, if we had to go back and listen to ourselves speaking, we realized that's not the format that's working. So then we decided to make it more conversational. And I think one of the big successes we have had in Masala History starting out was that topic of Jahangir.
Yes.
So we picked this Mughal emperor and his love for mangoes and his apparent sexual appetite that came out of eating mangoes. And then we did a whole, and we read a primary, I think it was
Jahangir's autobiography.
Okay. So it was biography where he talked about for mangoes, and so then we read more about it from mangoes to his sexual proclivities and all of that.
Mic distance.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Is it better?
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay.
Thank you for checking on us.
Thank you for letting us know. I'm just gonna hold it up like this.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think when we had a conversation about it, so one thing.
Thanks, Jasmine.
So one thing to know is that for a non-academic audience, especially, they have that interest in the and
The audio is coming and going. That's sorry about that. We have a full day, so by the end of the day we'll have a working system in. Manamee is going to be back. It's over there, Janet, if you're looking for that.
That's fine. Hopefully this is better. So we realized that, people want to know about Jahangir. They have, okay, awesome. Thank you, Kevin. So we realized people want to know more, but they don't have the time or necessarily have the patience to read these kind of monographs that we as historians have made a profession out of reading. So it was about piquing people's interest in a historical topic, but talking about it, bringing in our academic perspective, but talking about it to a non-academic audience. And I think that's really important, is to not use the highfalutin language that we would be using if we were writing an article or if we were presenting at a conference of our peers, but to reach to that wider audience. And I think people love that Jahangir podcast, for starters, because they want to know these interesting historical tidbits, but they don't want to necessarily get into the critical analysis of Jahangir and his rule and all of that. Another topic of interest that came about was the British exhibition that they had. And that again came about because, one of us found these primary sources and didn't really have the time to kind of put it in an article, but still wanted to reach out to the audience. So initially, that's how it started out. It was just her and I talking and people listening to us. And one of the things that Deepthi did was to ask our followers, ask our audience, like, what is it that you want to know more about? And people came up with ideas. Hey, can you tell us more about this person? Or can you tell us more about this historical moment? And we had access to that information. And so that's how it started. But I think Deepthi, with her expertise, has really taken the production level of this podcast to a whole different level. So initially it was just her and I speaking. We would have I think you would overlay some images of the exhibition or of the Jahangir topic
On our website.
On our website, Masala History. But then last year, thank you. Last year, she kind of took it to a whole different level. And this is, again, I'm not trying to plug Masala History, but but this one topic that she worked on, which was pirates, and we'll play a clip from that now, is the production value is just as important as the content of it. So do we have it? So yeah. We'll just listen to this clip.
So I think this is working. Okay. Just to introduce you to the idea of the kind of storytelling that we are in, and that often happens, that I think academic podcasts kind of follow through. If you like Radiolab or Code Switch or Throughline in all NPR shows, I'm a huge fan of NPR podcasts. It's basically sort of narrative storytelling. And that narrative storytelling can take on many forms. And I wanted to show you one example. We wanted to show you one example with Masala History. So I'm just going to play quickly the first couple of minutes of one of our episodes from before we went on sabbatical. Oh, before we start, this is about European pirates in the Indian Ocean. Can they hear? Okay, I've been told that you can't hear the recording.
No sound. So maybe if you wanted to share the
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to put the link on the, oh, this is not Mac. Okay. Okay, I'm going to paste the link, and if you can listen to the first 2 to 3 minutes of this podcast, it's episode 13, European Pirates in the Indian Ocean, and then maybe come back and we can have a short discussion about what do you take, what kind of storytelling are we going for? Thanks, Jasmine, for following on Spotify. We're just playing the clip here as well.
The whole thing. I will ask a question because this production is so good. I'll be like, okay, so you tell us how long it takes to put the whole thing together. Because that will give them an idea.
Okay, we over here have reached sort of like the 3-minute mark where the title music sort of started off, and then so this is sort of the kind of narrative storytelling single format that we've done for this particular episode. This format is still evolving and we're changing, and we're thinking of new things to do with once we come out of our sabbatical, hopefully in 2022. But this is a glimpse of what we're doing with Masala History.
And to also, sorry, not to interrupt, but to give you an idea. So this is the kind of production value that Masala History is going for. But to give Deepthi credit where credit is due, if I could ask her, like, how long did it take you from the stage of recording to putting the audio mix and all of that? How long did the production of it take?
So it takes time. This is what you just heard is, I was a self-taught podcast producer, and we'll talk about the different roles within podcast production in a bit. But it takes a while to get there. So we started very simply with just the two of us talking. There was an intro track, there was an outro track, and that's it, we're done.
And some images overlaid, which
On the website.
Yeah.
We didn't, obviously, it was an audio
Right.
podcast. But we kind of developed from there. For example, in that first 3 minutes, which I hope at least some of you were able to hear from the website, we have, I have mixed multiple soundtracks. The seagulls is a separate track. The pulley track is separate. The noise that the people make in the background, that's separate. The church bells are separate. And I pull these tracks from freely available audio, and I can point you to some of these websites where you can find that. And then you mix them. And then into that, you're adding more music, narration. And then that was my cousin talking as a pirate. He was living with us during the pandemic, and I made good use of him.
free labor, always use family and friends.
Yes, especially when it's like a home production podcast. Use family and friends as much as you can. So hot tip. Yes, Deanna, we're doing all the production and audio editing by ourselves. Yes, so it's a very labor intensive process to make this sort of an episode. Now I'm going to play you an episode of PhD Futures Now. Whoops, sorry, my bad. Still getting used to moving this mouse. Oh no, what is going
I
on?
think because you're clicking on I think it's not. Go back to, it just press,
Okay, there we go. Thank you. So these are the other two podcasts that I work on, Consolation Prize and PhD Futures Now. I'm going to play PhD Futures Now a little bit later as well, but for now, I'm just going to put our latest, our episode 3 in the chat. Where's the chat? And if you can listen to the first couple of minutes of PhD, oh man,
it's not a
I'm not doing good with PC right now. Let's put this here. This is episode 3 of PhD Futures Now that came out earlier in 2021. So if you can't listen to it when I'm playing it, if you can play the first 3 minutes, I'd be very grateful. Yeah.
And then go more.
Yeah. Let's see. Come on, play nice.
And then is there share computer audio?
Share sound, yes. Okay, I think we've solved this. Yes. Oh, come on, come back.
Go down.
Come back. Okay,
Okay, let's see.
let's see if this works.
Yeah.
Let us know if you can hear it when I play this.
This is PhD Futures Now,
Yes.
a podcast on collaboration, career diversity, and graduate education in the humanities. This podcast is a project of Humanities Without Walls, a 16-university consortium headquartered at the Humanities Research Institute at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and funded by grants from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation.
Today on PhD Futures Now, we are joined by Leonard Cassuto and Robert Weisbuch, co-authors of a new book entitled The New PhD, How to Build a Better Graduate Education, published earlier this year by Johns Hopkins University Press. Len is a professor of American literature at Fordham University and writes the Graduate Advisor column in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which focuses on contemporary issues in American doctoral training and advising. He is also the author of The Graduate School Mess, published by Harvard University Press in 2015. Bob is the former president of the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation and served as the president of Drew University from 2005 to 2012.
I'm going to forward it
Len
a
and
little
Bob,
bit.
welcome to the Humanities Without Walls Consortium, and thank you for joining us today on HWW's new podcast series, PhD Futures Now.
Great to be here. It's not only great to be here, but we're so glad that you exist as an organization. It's so important that you're doing.
So again, pitching for PhD Futures Now, apparently. But the idea is like, that's a very different style of podcasting, right? Like it's an interview format. And it's like a straightforward interview format where we use Quadcast, but you can do this on Zoom, but it is like a person-to-person conversation. We do send them questions ahead of time. So we have some discussions and then we ask them those questions and they kind of, talk about it. Those things are very loosely, it's not scripted. It's just that we're sending them questions. So
Is it meant for a more academic audience?
yes, it's meant for a very niche audience. I mean, I think all these podcasts that I'm talking about right now are kind of niche in a way, but PhD Futures now is specifically for people who work in higher education professionals, faculty members, and graduate students, especially PhD students, and especially humanities PhD students. So the content itself is very much very narrow and very focused, and it kind of dives into all these things that we live every day. So it's just very intense, and so we don't have a lot of music in it or any of that kind of
Production.
the
elements.
production elements. And so in many ways that's an easier podcast to produce. So there are different ways in which you can get into podcasting, and everything does not have to be as complicated as the Masala History episode that we showed. So now for the next session, Manamee is going to talk about just sort of humanities podcasting broadly, I think, and then we are going to talk about different kind of formats.
Okay. So these are topics that we have kind of touched upon. So, I mean, clearly so far, about 35 minutes into this webinar, you've obviously kind of realized that she is the production whiz when it comes to the podcast. And what we do with the podcasting, she's kind of like the person in charge of production, editing. That is all, like the final value is all her. But I think again, I mean, and like I said, is about reaching a larger audience, is to pick topics of interest and to kind of have from early on to hold their attention, which is again something that we've received in feedback. To hold their attention, you have to kind of get into the topic right away, and we have to kind of get into what is the topic, repetition, and then finally what is it that they're going to get out of it. So just to kind of why podcasting, and I think I mentioned this again, is to kind of take the historical research that we do for a living. And again, I'm talking from the perspective of an art historian and a historian, but any other discipline that you're in, it's about taking something that you are passionate about, and that probably 100 other people in the whole world will be passionate about, and making it palatable to oh, is it better now? I should just go back to that other mic.
It's fine.
Okay, thank you. Is passionate about and reaching a larger audience. So it's also a question of, is podcast a part of public history? And yes, it absolutely is a part of public history, because not everyone out there will have access to archives, will have the time or the patience to kind of dedicate to going in there and reading historical things and and really talking about it. So I think that's where we as humanities people, we as social scientists can really make the difference to bring those humanities topics to make it accessible to a larger audience. And I think podcast kind of gives you the perfect format. You don't have to necessarily, it only involves one of your senses, that is listening. And you can listen to it, there's the flexibility, you can listen to it whenever you want to, you can pause, go back, rewind, forward, do all of it as many times as you want to. And so the accessibility, the flexibility that podcasting gives you, and also the other thing that you get to do, which, if you're writing in an academic journal, you have to go through an editing process, things that you would want to be included. The editors might say, no, this is not this is not important. We've all faced those kind of issues. But in podcasting, you can really kind of get to the meat that you want to get to. And I think the other reason why podcasts really work, other than, the production, the music, the soundtracks, all of it, the other important thing is that, when you're talking about the topic and something that you are so passionate about, and you will realize this without even consciously being aware of it, is that you will sound really passionate about it when you are talking about it. So whether, especially when we had like conversations, one of the topics that we did was one of the viceroys of British Empire, Curzon. He built this whole big palace in Calcutta, and he wrote like 2 volumes on why the palace was constructed the way it was. He goes into description of, this is a room that's going to be designed with all of this royal paraphernalia. This is how, there'll be a huge portrait of Queen Victoria and all of that. And so, we talked about it, and she brought in her architectural perspective. I brought in the historical perspective to really talk about why was Raj Bhavan created the way it was. So to reach that public historical audience and to talk about these topics in a manner that is relatable to them. So to make it relatable, like, why is it that I would want to know about the Raj Bhavan? Because it is a landmark in British architectural history. And these landmarks aren't created just because they want to create it. There's a history, there's a logic behind it. And to kind of get the audience to think about it and to think about what they see around them and to approach it in a historical manner. So podcast, what it does is it makes the information accessible, and it kind of nudges them to think in an academic manner, even though they might not be thinking about the fact that they are thinking about it from a critical perspective.
So that said, as an academic, you don't have to create podcasts for public audiences.
Right.
That's what we do, but you don't have to. And you can decide, and this we'll get into more when we do the idea generation, so the breakout session later this afternoon. But basically, defining your audience is central to podcasting. You want to talk to people, but who are you talking to? Who do you want to convey what you have to convey to? So content, yes, but audience, and sort of defining that audience is very important. And we'll get into that in the first breakout session we'll have after lunch. But also the question, should you podcast? Is there a need to podcast? Podcasting, in many ways, there's a lot of talk about how it's saturated. There are so many podcasts just mushrooming around the world. So is there a need to podcast? And that's a good question. It's a very valid question. There's also, in terms of just access, right? The more podcasts there are, the more split the audience is. But there's a lot of research that has been done recently. NPR did this in collaboration with Edison's research lab about podcasting. And on an average, about a person listens to about 7 podcasts. Now, not every day, but on an average, in their roster, they have 7 podcasts. So podcast listenership is just going up. It's not going down. So if you're worried about audience reach, and I'll tell you why you shouldn't be worried about audience reach in a minute. But if you're worried about audience reach because you want to monetize your podcast, or you want to, be on the top whatever 50 list, or you want to get one of those podcasting awards, then yes, you need to be very cognizant of why you're putting this thing together. But if you are worried about, if you're only worried about a niche audience, say you're podcasting about museology, as I think Will Mary said, who is your audience? And that audience, if it's only 60 people, and out of those 60 people, 40 listen to your podcast, then that's a very well done podcast. That's a very successful podcast, right? So it's important to think about the benefits of actually putting audio out there. Another option is also that audio is not as engaging as video. So then the question is, when you're starting a podcast, do you want to start it as a podcast, or do you want to now think about like a visual component to it, because that's a whole different world out there. And so why podcast is a question that only you can answer for yourself, and what kind of material or content you're putting out there. But you don't always have to podcast if you don't want to, or if you don't see sort of the cost benefit there in terms of reach, in terms of your own satisfaction, in terms of how the content is delivered. Maybe the topic that you have in mind is better delivered through video than audio. So you want to consider those kinds of questions.
About like knowing your audience.
Yes.
Right. Knowing who, like, I mean, she clearly works on various podcast projects, but me working with her on Masala History, it's defined in the sense it is South Asia humanities being talked about by two people that apparently know some amount to have a conversation, to know what is it, how can we make this academic information palatable to a popular audience. Right. So that's the niche that we are coming in with, or that's the expertise that we are offering.
Yeah. So before we, any questions? If you have any questions, can you put it in the chat for us so that we can keep track of that? And we, no, we have time. But like if you start putting your questions in the chat, then we can do like a Q&A once we finish the next couple of slides.
There's a question.
Yeah.
Also, there's a chat.
Hold on, let me go back. Oh, quickly though, we have lunch break at 12 and then 12 to 1. And then when we come back, we're going to do 2 sessions. One is for podcast idea generation and the other is podcasting tech. And depending on, your interest, we can either do more of one and less of the other, but we can talk about that as we move into the latter half of the workshop. Okay, so
questions.
Let's see if there are questions. Okay, so there is a Q&A section, and I think Janet would like you to put the Q&A, the questions in the Q&A instead of the chat. What are some of the pros and cons of sending your interviewees your questions before their interview? So if you're doing an interview format, now we'll get into formats in just a second, but quickly here, if you have an interview format, within the interview format podcasting, there are different kinds. Is it formal? Is it sort of like semi-casual? Or is it like a casual sort of rolling about, like the, just going, ambling along a path? Is it like a drunk conversation? Like there are different ways in which. So if you're sending your interviewees your questions, then immediately the first thing that happens is that rolling kind of conversation is not going to happen, because you're talking on podcast makes people nervous somehow. I don't know what it is. Like even if you're just using Zoom, it makes people nervous. So they want to be prepared. It makes them anxious and they want to prepare. So you get somewhat prepared questions, and especially in the first couple of questions that you ask, you get very prepared answers. And then once they relax, it kind of like, gets a little more natural. But that's, I think, one of the problems with sending questions, that you will get prepared answers. So even if you're doing interview format, you can choose what kind of interview format you want. If you want your guests comfortable, in their best spirits, really prepared to answer a question and really portray themselves in their performative self, to use jargon, I couldn't help myself, then you actually send them the questions ahead of time. It also makes your life a lot easier because you are prepared, you know what's coming. But if you want like a more organic conversation, then you can send them some bullet point hints, but then not send them like actual questions. So depends on your format and the comfort level you have with your guests.
But again, like she said, to kind of reiterate, the 3 interview formats that we did, one, we personally knew each one of the 3 of we did 3, 4, yeah. And so, there was that they all wanted the questions ahead of time. We did send them, they sent us, like, we said, okay, this is a topic that you know more about. Would you want to talk about it? And they were all excited, and they sent us like readings that they wanted to be included in the podcast. And we drew questions from their expertise from the readings, and we sent it to them, and they all wanted the questions ahead, and we went into it. And I remember for each of them, we had questions prepared. But once we got talking to them, and once they kind of got over their initial hesitation of, oh my God, I'm being recorded, my voice is being recorded, so I need to sound a certain way. And then once they got comfortable talking about their expertise, then I think it flowed much more naturally. And then we weren't even really like sticking to the questions that we had. It's kind of, and I think as interviewers, it's kind of our job to make them comfortable, to make them feel like, forget the mic in front of you, forget the fact that you're being recorded. We're basically having a Zoom chat about, say, this book that you have written that you are clearly passionate about and want to talk about. So I think it depends. There's a lot of onus on the interviewer as well to make that interviewee feel comfortable and to get past their initial hesitation.
Right. And okay, one of the other questions, Jasmine, about your question about India. Yeah, it's a little, I can put you in touch with a couple of Indian podcasters to ask how, but like my friend who does Echoes of India and Yuddha, the two history podcasts, he is working with a bigger podcast production company. But yeah, Anchor is the one that I also know. And yes, it is very difficult to monetize that way, and monetize in India by using Anchor and connecting it to Spotify. So monetization, if you're interested in that, then that has to be, it's a social media game. And we can talk about that later if you want to, because it's a complex, there's a complex process there. Nashiali had a question in the Q&A about setting up a studio. Our first studio cost us $15 because we bought like a very cheap mic. And if you go to episode 1, never listen to episode 1 of Masala History. Don't do it.
Was
Don't
that
do it
the
yourself.
exhibition one?
I can't remember now, but like, whatever it was.
No,
like,
I think, in fact, I think you guys are blessed, because the first 2 episodes that we recorded, we never put it up. Because
true.
I think she listened to mine, I listened to hers, and we made the editorial decision never to put it out
never
there
show
on
anyone what that is.
on the
like,
web.
it was just horrible.
Yeah.
But like that can happen, by the way. Like, you could record all this work in, and then you realize it's like a episode that you really can't put out. So
Yeah.
that can happen.
Yeah.
Not often, but it happens. But to Nashili's question, like you don't need a lot of equipment to actually do podcasting. What we have now, like, right now we record, because both of us, when we started Masala History, we were at UIC. So we would just go to my house or, record we've actually recorded here in the library in Idea Commons, actually one of the rooms upstairs. But you can do it in person, like, but if you're doing it online, things like free apps like Zoom, for example, gives you separate audio tracks for each attendee of the Zoom who's being recorded. So, and if they all have like reasonably good mics, and when I say reasonably good mics, just the ones that, the iPhone mics, which you can plug into your laptop and then use as a headphone and mic, that's good enough audio. The thing that beginning level podcasters obsess over is quality, like audio quality. And one of the things that I've realized over time is audio quality, if you can get it up, that's great. But when you begin, it's not quality, it's content. And so if you have the kind of content that you have confidence in, the audio quality really does not matter. And that means, if you can get a cheap mic and get away with it. Right now, we don't have very expensive, like I don't have very expensive stuff at my house. Manamee doesn't either. But where I spend my money right now is on production. So I do have Logic Pro X, which is sort of the elder sister of GarageBand for Mac users. I don't work with Audacity anymore because Logic Pro X gives me a lot more versatility and to work with different with editing. I spend money on websites, like, you know, putting together a nice looking website. So that's where my costs come. In terms of Masala History, like, you know, we actually spend a lot of money on, not a lot of money, we spend a reasonable amount of money, but each year it's like anywhere between $300 to $500, I would say, which is on the whole not much now that we've graduated and we actually have an income. So,
Have full-time jobs.
Yeah, that kind of helps. But regarding equipment, what you really need is a good mic. And a good mic can be bought for like about $50 or $60. And as long as you can get the mic, connect it to your computer and talk to someone else over Zoom, you're good to go. There are other paid apps that does the Zoom thing, but does it slightly better, like Squadcast, which is one of the most expensive options. But there's also slightly lesser options like Ali2 and Zencaster that you can use. Anchor, that Jasmine mentioned earlier, is free, and you can actually record and stream through it. I've never used Anchor, but like I've heard that that's like almost a free option, just if you want to just test the waters.
To add to that, and because I have made this mistake many times, and Deepthi has suffered the consequences because she's the one who's doing the editing and the production, is that sometimes when you're recording the podcast, even you have headphones on and you start recording and you're like, okay, this sounds fine to me. When I'm speaking, it sounds fine to me. I don't hear an echo. I can hear the interviewee can hear me, fine, good to go. But then when she goes into editing, sometimes, and you know, her and I have come close to having blows about this, and she's like, where are you recording from? I can hear something in the background. And I said, well, I didn't hear anything in the background. So I think it's very important to be aware of your surrounding, where you're sitting and recording, because you're going to get, unless you have someone like her, it's going to be a huge problem for you when you go into editing, because when you're recording, you probably don't hear it. But when she's editing, she's like, I can hear something in the background. And this has happened to us, I think, a couple of times, that something she's picked up on.
So yes, this is very important. What the most important thing to make your life easier when you're podcasting is to find a quiet place to record. A closet is the best. If you sit in front of your clothes and record, you get the best sound quality that, you know, it's like, I wouldn't say it's studio level because obviously that's exaggeration, but like it's really, really good sound quality. In a closed environment with a lot of absorptive materials in front of you, and, you know, sort of like closer in, that closer to the mic, closer in, buy a $2 or $3 pop filter, which is basically a thing that goes over your mic that controls your plosives, and we'll get to plosives in a little bit in detail. But if you can get that, that's all the thing that you need to record. So
is there a way to check the recording while they are recording, or can they only do it?
You'll have to play it back.
Okay.
Like you'll have to stop and play it back. But if you're just beginning to podcast or thinking about podcasting in a more professional way, I would say, and if you're doing it mainly from your house or wherever you are, find that best corner to podcast from your house, where there's a Wi-Fi connection, where there's good absorptive materials. Sometimes it's a closet, sometimes it's like a little corner of your room. You want to identify the environment where you want to record, and it doesn't have to be professionally done. If it is professionally done, like right now at Roy Rosenzweig Center where I work, we just got a $1 million Mellon grant to start a history podcasting studio, which is called the R2 Studios. So if you have podcasting ideas, historians, pitch it to R2 Studios now, because, you know, they
have the money.
Yeah, we have $1 million now to work on specifically history podcasting. So basically, because we have that grant, we have invested in this place, an office room that's converted to a studio, where we have a $500 mic, the Shure SM7B, which is the podcasting mic. And I will not deny there is a difference in sound quality. Like you can actually hear the sort of like the person is like in your ear when they talk. So we have a Rodecaster Pro, which is like a audio mixing interface, which is sort of the highest end. And those things actually make a difference. So one of the podcasts that we produce now, it's called the Green Tunnel Podcast. It's a new podcast that's headed by the director of the center, Ms. Kelly, and it's about the history of the Appalachian Trail. And it's just started. It's on episode 3, and it's doing really, really well. And you can actually hear, like the first episode, we had like an ASMR thing where he's just walking on grass and pebbles, and it's just delightful. And that happens because of that higher quality audio. When you start out, you don't need that. So, sorry, long-winded answer to that question. Yes, you can record with your iPhone or any phone that has a good mic. Okay, so if you don't have any more questions right now, what we can do is I'm going to play a couple of episodes from a couple of podcasts that I like. And what you want to do is to listen for clues to what is the subject matter, who is the intended audience, what is the podcast format, what is appealing about the podcast, and would you listen to the podcast? And just put in your answers in the chat window as we listen. And this is the first one. It's from NPR's Code Switch.
Just a heads up, y'all. The following episode contains some salty language, so buckle up for some cussing. What's good, y'all? You're listening to Code Switch from NPR. I'm Gene Demby. And let me tell you about this listener named Renee that I met one day. So Renee Hidalgo told me the first time he realized that people might not see him as white was when he was in the first grade. It was around 1991, and he and his boy were talking about Vanilla Ice, of all people.
For whatever reason, Vanilla Ice really appealed towards like 10-year-olds because it was in the Ninja Turtles movie. And somebody was like, it's like, oh wow, this white rapper, nobody's ever seen that before. And my friend Shane was like, I don't think he's white. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, no, I think he's like Puerto Rican or something like you. And I was like, but I am white. And he was like, no, you're not. And like years later, I'm like, man, I learned that I'm not white because of Vanilla Ice. That is not right.
Renee was born in New York City in the early 1980s to a Cuban immigrant father and an American-born Cuban Puerto Rican mother.
My parents never taught me how to speak Spanish. The only time it was really spoken in the house was between my parents when they didn't want me to know what was going on.
Renee said his parents had very different politics from each other, right? So his mom is really conservative, like she voted for Trump. His father, though, was a socialist. But one thing they consistently agreed on, that they hit on over and over again, was that Renee was not to consider himself a person of color.
My parents even went so far as to repeatedly tell me, don't ever let anyone tell you you aren't white.
When he was young, Renee's parents sent him to this crunchy, private K-12 school. It was on the Upper West Side. And it had the kind of parents who wanted a very progressive approach to learning, but who were also the kind of parents who would never send their kids to a public school. Renee said at that school, his race didn't matter nearly as much as socioeconomics did.
The majority of the student body was affluent, but about 5 kids in my year, including myself, were on scholarships, financial assistance, and came from working class families. There were also, really no surprise here, the only people of color. I'm not going to paint this as a horrible situation. It honestly wasn't. But for the most part, it was a warm and welcoming environment. The worst of it was being made to feel bad because I couldn't afford to go to space camp or whatever. I can't say the black kids had the same experience I had, so we'll take that with a big grain of salt. There was very little.
Okay, so I played about 2.5 minutes of that clip. So can you, from this sort of 2 minutes, 38 seconds, tell me what the subject matter is? I mean, obviously, feel free to look at the screenshot because, that's part of the podcast as well, what they put out there, or who the intended audience is, and what are they going for? What is the field that they're going for? Yes, yeah, it's about race and race relations. Zena says, reflection on generation gaps, right? Music is too overwhelming. That's interesting. I have this problem with generally with NPR podcasts. Younger generation audience. Yeah, no, that's great. So we're going to play another clip now, and we're going to do the same thing. And so just put your answers in the chat. Where are we? Sorry. Okay, this is from a couple of you mentioned stuff you should know. So this is the episode on Salem witchcraft trials that came out around the time of Halloween, and we're going to do the same thing again.
This is Jialin Yang, national editor at the New York Times. More than 1,700 journalists work at the Times. They come from all over, from Iraq to Iowa. They speak Arabic, Spanish, Korean. But there's one thing they all have in common. They've dedicated their lives to helping us understand the world. Everything the New York Times publishes starts and ends with their commitment.
That's the ad.
Times subscribers keep our work at the Times.
Well, then let me introduce you to Squarespace. Squarespace empowers millions of dreamers, makers, and doers by providing them with the tools they...
Welcome to Stuff You Should Know, a
If you're wondering if they have monetized, yes, they have.
production of iHeartRadio.
And when you're ready to launch, and this is Stuff You Should Know.
That's right. Spooky witch trials.
Yeah, yeah. It is. It's really nice to like have stuff like this that you can be removed from by a few hundred years and, you know, just kind of evokes that Halloween spirit or whatever. But Chuck, I have found just in recently researching this, if you put yourself into the position of the people who are like walking to the gallows and like think about how nuts all this was, it is exponentially scarier on a much more existential level. It goes beyond like Halloween spooky to this is a genuinely frightening event in the history of America.
No kidding.
I mean, like it was messed up in every way, shape, or form.
So I take it you never read The Crucible.
I did read The Crucible, but I read it in the
context. And that didn't do it?
No, it really didn't. Because
Wow.
I don't know if it was me. Maybe I wasn't mentally or emotionally prepared to accept it on that level. Who knows? But no, it was like imagining myself in the shoes of the people who are going to die. That got me researching.
Wow.
This. Yeah. Yeah.
That's dark.
No shade though on Arthur Miller. He was great, and his play was great, and it was very timely for the time.
Yeah, I mean, there have been so many kind of movie adaptations and TV movie adaptations about this time, and I'm still waiting for sort of the one great one that's not The Crucible.
Well, I think part of the reason why there hasn't been that great one yet is because historians are still like actively competing at explaining just what exactly happened in Salem. It's such an anomaly. Even among like Puritans, even among people who believed there was such a thing as witchcraft and even executed witches, this was a genuine anomaly, at least as far as American history goes. And I think because they don't understand it fully, it's difficult to really get the point across as well, you know?
I don't know, man. I think you could make a great movie. Like, look at The Witch. That danced around it so well. Like, you just need a movie like that, but based on this.
Well, why don't we just say The Witch then is all we need?
Well, because it wasn't about the Salem witch trials.
But I mean, it was so analogous.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. But basically, this particular episode was on the Salem witchcraft trials, as the heading says there. I'll ask you something a little different. How is this format or style different from Code Switch that we listened to earlier? I'm just going to put that in the chat. Right. Yeah, it's a conversational dialogue.
It's taking
Mark. We're looking at Mark, who's sitting here, our only in-person audience right now.
It's like you're almost frustrated because you're like, just get to the point. Just, yeah. Stop taking this walk around the park to get to it. You have some Q&A as well.
It's a totally different audience. I tend to zone out of these sort of conversational podcasts. Wendy just does not like this either. I think it's Wendy. I'm sorry. Yes, Wendy.
I still don't know what they're going to talk about. Get to the point.
So I'll tell you why I chose these two. And I think I have one more. Actually, I'll play that clip also, and then I'll tell you why I chose these ones. So that was Code Switch. Then we listened to Stuff You Should Know. I'll have to play it here. These are called, they're called the Art History Babes. And this is their episode called Hot Takes, Drunk History. I'm going to play it a little bit.
The dialogue of the drunk person, and it's just brilliant. It's so funny and so clever.
It's so funny, and I wish it was my job,
Yeah.
Damn it.
Well, I mean, like, that's kind of what we're trying to do here. So
it is, but also, like, we have to stay above a certain. I almost just said certain, so that just shows where I'm at. But a certain threshold, I feel like. Or does no one else feel that way? Should I be getting more drunk? Oh my God, Natalie, get wasted. Like, what are you doing tomorrow, honestly?
Oh my God.
Working.
Bitch, it's fine.
I feel like we ebb and flow. I feel like we have episodes where we get very silly. And then, I mean, we have episodes where we haven't, drank a drop too. So, like, it's not like, you know.
Not me.
Okay, so
that was entertaining.
So here's so in the chat, if you could tell me, all three of these episodes, these podcasts kind of look at least in these episodes that I showcase, look at historical topics, and we're going back to history because that's our realm. But like that, they actually do it in different ways. And if you can, in the chat, tell me what are some of the pros and cons of each of those ways of talking about history or historical topics or humanities at large. This is everything I hate about some podcasts. Okay. Mark coming in strong. What even is that? Okay. So Art History Babes podcast is they started out when they were grad students at UC Berkeley, and they would sit together, drink wine, and talk about an artist, like an artist or an art historian.
It's like that show, Drunk History, but basically in a podcast format.
Yeah.
That doesn't help because even the show.
But I will say, Art History Babes podcast, listen to the episode called The Bad Boys of Baroque. I love that episode. So I will not, there are some that are like really good, really well done. Even through but it's again difficult to sometimes keep track of their conversations. Kevin says, I don't yet have a relationship with these presenters, so it seems pretty self-serving. That's true. Yeah, you can turn off listeners with something like that. If especially that last one, if that's the first episode you're listening, you're not going to listen to Art History Babes. So they're taking a risk by doing something like that. Very drunk, Jasmine. Yes, very drunk. Yes, Martinis and murder is the same concept, kind of done a little better, I would say. So like the point of this was of bringing these different, bringing up these different kind of podcasts, the same kind of content delivered in different ways. Now these are just three different ways. but there are literally, like, you can make it up in any which way you want, depending on the complexities you want to showcase, the content you want to showcase, how your personality kind of sleeps into your podcast. So it's always good to think about formatting and style as it relates to you and the kind of audience that you want to share. We have about, you can continue to put the questions in the Q&A. I know there's one question there. I'll answer it in a second. But what I wanted to do is quickly talk about podcasting overview. Like what does it take to make, what's the process like? So on the outset, I would say it's pretty simple. You first plan, like if it is a limited series, then you plan for the entire season, right? You plan how many episodes you want, what is the narrative arc you want for the podcast, what are you, it's a little bit like you're writing a book or a dissertation where you can plan it out. But if it's like an unlimited series, like, it's going to go on as long as, you want to do it, then you're planning for each episode and each episode's content from the get-go. And so, and we'll do some of this in a post-lunch where we do an idea generation session where we will think about these questions in more detail. So no need to kind of jot this down or think about it this is just sort of an introduction, and we'll pick it up post-lunch. You plan, and the planning will include the format, the length, the research that you need, and scripts. You write scripts if you need scripts. And you do all those things. Interviews, I don't think I know, sort of scheduling interviews, I didn't note there in the planning session, but that's an important part if you're doing an interview style podcast. And once you do all the planning, then you record, either in person or online, and then you go into production with, which is sort of like the most labor intensive portion. I shouldn't say that, that's actually not fair. I do a lot of production, so it's labor intensive for me. But I think the most labor intensive is the planning and the production portions, I would say. All these different things take time, but planning and production takes the most time. And once the production is done, then comes the part of publishing. You publish the episode on a podcast hosting platform. It is bad practice to directly publish it onto your website. Your website can't handle that kind of storage requirements. And then you have to also, very important, marketing and social media engagement. Even if you're not monetizing, if you want more audience reach, you have to consider marketing and social media. There's no other way out of it, unless you're already within an established institution which has a ready audience. Like if the Smithsonian starts a podcast, they don't need to worry about marketing because they have a giant marketing machine, right? But so this whole process of planning, recording, production, and publishing, and then that's for one episode, and then you have to start it all over again for the next episode. So managing those different aspects, I think that gets trickier as you start producing. But essentially, that's basically what the podcasting process is. I'm just going to do that. Let's see in the chat. Yeah, yes, Jasmine. Questions. So Miriam's question about what platform do we recommend? Like, it depends on what that's one place, as I said before, the place where we actually spend money is on these things, on the production side of things. And so we host with Blueberry. I think it's spelled BLUBRRY, I think. But I use Buzzsprout for the PhD Futures Now podcast. We use Spreaker for the Consolation Prize podcast at the center where I work. But they all cost some amount of money to about, I would say if you want to release about 1 or 2 episodes a month or 2 to 3 episodes a month, it will cost you about $10 to $15 a month to host that. But essentially that process is finding a podcast hosting service, and all these podcast hosting services actually will allow you to upload to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Music, I think Google Podcasts it's called. And basically Anchor will let you post on Spotify, I believe, and Anchor is free, or free to some extent. I'm sorry if I'm giving you the wrong information, but I know it's free to some extent. So it depends on what your budget is, how many podcasts and the length of podcast episodes that you're producing, and then you decide on the podcast hosting platform. The biggest no-no is directly just publishing onto your website. Don't do that, it's a nightmare. Should we create a marketing plan during the planning stage? I don't know quite how to answer you.
I'll put it like this, because while I think my contribution comes more into the planning stage, so rather than coming up with a marketing plan, what we do is, especially with South Asia, what we did last year, there were two big events. Well, it's still continuing, started last year, and it's still in news today. One is India's reaction to how they completely bungled in reacting to COVID. That was one. And the second one was this farmers' protest, which was a very big deal in North India, where you had the farmers who were out on the streets protesting against, heavy tariffs that the government was imposing on them. So those were two topics that were already in the news. So we decided to kind of use, I don't want to say we, took advantage, so to speak, but we took that topic, especially of the farmers' protest, and we found a scholar who teaches at MSU, and her entire research and work is on the farmers' relationship with the Indian economy. And we brought her in to give a historical perspective to show that from the colonial times, the British have always levied higher and higher taxes to the farmers, and then seeing how this government has been reacting to it. So sometimes I think at the planning stage, it's important to know the audience. Second, it's also important to see, what is out there, which is making news right now. And so once you realize what's making news, it's always then interesting to say, okay, how can I inform my followers, or how can I inform our audience more about this? And so our expertise then comes in to give the historical perspective, to say if the farmers are out on the streets protesting, it's not happening in isolation. There is a historical background to it. And so then they listen to the podcast, then they can make more sense of what is happening right now. So even with COVID, and I believe then the episode takes the shape of, how has diseases been spread in British India? How did the British react in the big cities to the outbreak of diseases? And then to kind of draw parallels, and I think we had two guests, I believe, and then to kind of say, okay, this is again not something new. India in general, whichever government is in power, if we want to consider the British a government, have always kind of bungled up their responses, but the British obviously reacted to it, came from a much more racial perspective. And this government is coming much more from an economic perspective.
So to try and summarize that point, it depends on what your content is and if it's timely. So sometimes you can plan all you want, and then something happens, and that's very, very very important or timely to what you do, or contemporaneous to whatever you're talking about. So you might have to drop your planning and then go do that episode. And so while planning is great in terms of like the story arc, planning for engagement and social media, it can take up all your time. And so the easiest way you can plan for that is by building that into your content in a way. I'm not sure if I answered that, Ashali, but we can talk more later. Documenting the process. Oh boy, if nothing else, have an audio transcript. We do this with Masala Histories last since like 2019. We've always had we use Otter to do this, the Otter transcription service to do this. But we record the final recording directly goes into Otter. We pick up the audio and put it on our website purely for accessibility purposes. One of the things that we don't want to do is, one of the things that we haven't talked about really is how podcasting is actually not a very, I mean, if you're a deaf person, like, you know, this is this entire ecosystem of podcasting is lost on you. So making podcasting more accessible, making a text equivalent of whatever you actually create in your episodes, in however sort of like basic form that you can, that's very important. And so each episode is documented in that sense. But if it's about documenting the process of making a podcast, God, I haven't done it. So I haven't done it for any of the podcasts that I've worked on. So I'm not quite sure how to do it. If anybody has ideas or have done it, please put it in the chat for us. Okay, do we have any more?
You're welcome.
So what we're going to do in the next half hour, we actually don't need half hour to do this because we have one in-person person that we can get hold of. But I want to kind of talk about what we're going to do in post-lunch when we come back at 1. We're going to be doing 2 breakout sessions. In the first breakout session, we are going to talk about idea generation. How do you actually go about thinking about audience? How do you think about creating content and subject matter and format and things like that? So Manamee is going to actually take you through that process. For this, there is a PDF that was shared. Janet, Carla, do they have access to the PDF? Okay, so yeah. So if you go to the website in the downloads, it's called the Podcasting Worksheet, and that's what we'll be using for that first breakout session.
Otherwise, isn't it on the slides as well?
Oh,
isn't it on the slides as well?
Yes, but like I will paste it in the chat when we're talking about it. But if you can get that downloaded during lunch, that'd be great. Also, I will talk briefly about Audacity as the DAW, as it's called, DAW. That's the digital audio workstation, which is basically where you produce tracks, and we'll talk basics about that. But I don't, because we are online in like a webinar format, I'm not quite sure how we can accomplish doing it. But what I want to do is, if you haven't already, download Audacity. And I'm using Audacity as an example, even though I don't personally use it, because it's free, it's for PC and Mac users, and so it's quite accessible. But I'll be showing you what I do in Logic Pro X, and I will take you through some of the basic things that we actually do while I'm actually producing these episodes. And so that will be session 2. And that's kind of how the afternoon is set up. If you have any questions, now is the time. We have some time to talk. If there's one thing that you want to know by the end of this workshop, what would that be? Just if you can put that in the chat. I think there's a recording. Wendy, I will put all the sources in a file and send it to you. I also forgot to mention that there's another handout which has our schedule, but also a full reading list of reading resources, depending on what kind of podcast you want to produce, what kind of format that you want to do. There are different kinds of reading, general and academically oriented readings. So I would highly advise you take a look at that at some point. Yes, resources. I will share it with you at the end of the day. Now, Shiri, all your questions will be answered in breakout session 1. That's what we're going to do as soon as we come back from lunch.
All energized after some food.
I'm now curious, if you already don't have a podcast, what is the podcast you have in mind? What kind of podcast do you want to make?
But we'll go through that in the
but I'm just
session.
Curious now because we
Okay.
have time.
Okay, right. How much time do we have?
We have about 20 minutes.
Okay.
Maybe I'll maybe forward some of the stuff so that there's more stuff to talk about the tech side. Maybe I should do some of the slides for the afternoon now.
But you want to do that first?
I mean, just introduction to what it looks like.
The final, like wait, which you want to get started on the afternoon stuff now?
I'm wondering.
But then it will be like a break.
Yeah. Interesting too.
Yeah. Okay.
And
then
so
what was Will Marie saying? Oh, welcome.
We're not going to go off the Zoom, right? Are we? Okay, that's yes, because I want to access the chat and go back to the chat in the next session. Yeah. So what we're going to do now is we're going to stop here. It's 11:40. We're going to come back at 1, right?
Yeah.
Right. A little before 1 would be great. And then we are going to set up to start with the first breakout session, which will be about talking about doing the things that we've already talked about in the morning and sort of getting our hands a little bit dirty in the process. So see you after lunch. Have some time off.
So then between the first breakout session and the second one, we get a
Jen,
break.
We are muted right now, I think. Yes.
So you shouldn't be.
Now you should
be. Yeah.
We good? Okay.
Okay, so if you can hear both of us, this is Deepthi checking in.
Hi, this is Manamee.
And if you can hear both of us, just
let us know.
Yes.
Okay, good. Awesome.
Good, great.
So hopefully, you guys got some rest and you're back all refreshed like we are after getting some food in us. So like Deepthi said, the second half of this podcast is going to be split up into 2 sessions. The first session is going to be more about, I'm looking at the screen and talking and not at the camera. Sorry about that. So the first session is going to be more about ideating. How do you come up with an idea? How would you, if you had to talk about your idea for a podcast in 1 sentence, how do you do that? Who is your target audience? So hopefully you guys all have the sheet, the PDF that was sent out, and you can see
that, and then you can see it. Just click on that.
This thing?
Yeah, just
Okay.
click. It'll take you. Yeah, and then just close this out.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So hopefully you guys can see the whole thing. So all you need to do for this is basically just some pen and paper, write it down. And the only way we can do this is by you guys responding to questions, ideas on chat, and then we will read it out and try and have a conversation about it. So the first thing is, project has to start with some kind of an intention, like what is it that your podcast is trying to do? If it's going to be just about, okay, let's just pause for a second because I don't think everyone has access to the document we're talking about.
going to control this.
Hi. Yeah, so this is basically the first slide that you see is basically kind of telling you what we are going to do in the next hour and a half. So the idea is that by the end of the first session, you can ideate and you can talk a little bit about what the plan with your podcast is going to be. At the preliminary stage of how do you plan it, how do you put it together, and then Deepthi will talk more about the production and the editing stage of it. And also it's not going to be as cut and dry. It's going to be, both of us will have a lot of things to say about it, and we will.
Just a quick reminder. This was meant to be, when we formulated this was an in-person thing. So it's not really formulated for a webinar thing, because I don't know if you saw in a previous slide, we had thought of working in groups. So now you're going to work on these individually. And so in one way, it's freeing, because now it gives you really time to think about that podcast that you want to do, that maybe you haven't gotten time to actually do.
Think about, right.
To think about. So that's great. Second thing, the podcasting worksheet that you see here comes from NPR's training studios. So we've changed very little we've kind of made some adjustments to the NPR worksheet, taking out some stuff, adding some stuff in, but it's largely NPR has this huge training resource. And again, I'll put all these links together and send you an email, or I'll let Carla know of a resource list that I can send to you later on. So if you have any requests for specific resources, just put them in the chat so that I'm keeping a note here, and then I'll send you all that information once we are done for the day. Go. Sorry.
No, it's fine. So let's just get into it. And as and when, we're going to try and make it as interactive as possible. So anytime you have an idea you want to share, feel free to add it on chat, and one of us will catch it and we will bring this up during while we are talking. So the next thing, okay, that doesn't, wait, okay, you go. Apparently technology and I are not good friends. Okay, so the first thing then, let's just brainstorm for about 2 or 3 minutes. And this again is at the
5 minutes.
Okay, so about 5 minutes. So let's just think about if you had to do a podcast, right? What would you call the project? In the sense, what would it be about? So let's just start with that. And that could be depending on your own personal interest. It could be based on your academic discipline that you're in, interest that you have. But what would the project be about? So if you can just take 5 minutes, think about it, and then just add to the chat. And then we'll go from there.
You can use the PDF worksheet
to write in,
or take a printout of it, or use it virtually if you want to just brainstorm ideas. But also, once you're done, if you can put your answers in the chat,
then we'll go through as many as we possibly can. And we have to when 1:45, right? No, 2:40. Okay, so we have time.
I'm just going to write that in the chat also.
Brainstorm your podcast idea. Contact. You are the podcast. Let me mute myself. I think I'm mic. Are you mic 1 or mic 2?
I think I'm mic 1.
Okay.
What you going to call the project is that the next thing.
It's just over there. My thing is not moving for some reason.
Yeah, these MacBook Pros are just
Useless.
absolutely useless.
I don't know where I am. Maybe ask Carla what the next one is. Maybe ask Carla. Like on her, you can pull it up on her thing. I think she has printouts of the PDF. Hold on. Maybe Carla, do you have a print the PDF with you? Yeah, I know it was here somewhere because when I came in, I saw them. Okay, no, that's fine. Huh? Yes. You said you wanted it. Oh, okay. If you have any questions while you're going through the process of thinking about the project, you can post those questions as well. So the answers for the questions in the chat and the questions in the Q&A so that we can keep track, that'd be great. We have about 2 minutes more for this exercise. I have the timer going. Oh, this one, sure. I don't need. One moment. About a minute more, and if you are, if you know what you're calling a project, you can now put it in the chat.
And again, it doesn't, at this point, it doesn't need to be a fully fleshed out research topic. It can, you could just, list some of your interest areas, just a topic that you're interested in, a subject matter. It can be as little as that, and then we can build on it as we go through it.
Okay, we're about done. So now if you can put your answers in the chat. What's your, what are you going to call your project, or what is your podcast idea?
And while you guys are doing that, we can start thinking, or we can start discussing some of your topic ideas. So if we start with Miriam's, you said informed science in Spanish. Okay. So our podcast is called Informed Science in Spanish. So is that something about the learning of science in the Spanish language? Is that what you would read from it?
I guess so, but we can ask her to elaborate.
Yes, yes, okay.
Okay, Wilmary, yes, museum history, exhibitions, exhibit reactions, analysis, collections, history, museum anthropology.
The nice,
wow. Phone. I love your name, but I don't know how to spell it, pronounce it. I'm sorry about that. But if you can give me like a pronunciation for your name in the chat, that'd be great. Thank you.
The Nigerian
That's
Market Shed,
interesting.
a survey of how women are managing everyday challenges from the side of the market. That's really interesting. Just so you know, in the reading list that we circulated, if you look in the category about, I think, academic podcasting, there are a couple of really interesting social sciences, academic podcasts that might actually be useful for you. Just to think about how people who are working sort of in the field that you're in are thinking about podcasting and what podcasting can be. And there's one article there about podcasting as activism. And so it's a really interesting sort of dialogue of academics, like, can academics be activists? And, you know, where does that line, like, is podcasting the place where academic activism can play a role? So it's a really interesting question for podcasts such as yours.
Okay. Any more ideas on site? Oh, wow.
Archival stories. I like the
oh, wow.
I like the title.
Stories or voices. Wow, that's okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
I like
some
voices.
awesome ideas. Let's give it one more minute and then we'll move on to the next one. Unsilencing archival stories. That could be a very, very interesting title for a book. Yeah. Unsilencing archival stories, like a full-fledged academic monograph. That would be.
I think there is a book called Unsilencing Voices, which is.
No, I'm saying, but this is specifically about archives.
Yeah, no, I think there's one. If I can remember, I'll put it in the chat. But I think there is a book out there.
Okay. But it's a very it's a very title that just, yeah.
So we're going to move, if you're still thinking about, I know there are more people in the group. So if you're still thinking about the project, let's keep doing that.
And we can keep coming back to, you know, in
whenever
various
you're ready
forms
with
and
it,
ways, we can keep coming back to it.
Yeah.
And just keep adding whatever your thoughts and opinions are. So keep adding. So the second, so now that we are thinking about what the broad topic will be, so now it's like, describe your project in one memorable sentence. So, you know, if you had to sell your podcast idea in one sentence, what would that sentence look like? So let's take another 5 minutes and think about what that sentence would be. Sentence, and also probably keywords about your project, right? So keywords, sentence, let's just think about it.
If you want a little bit of guidance about this, if you think about step 1 as the title of the project, think about step 2 as the subtitle that describes it a little bit more. Yeah. You have about a minute and a half left, and if you are done, you can begin posting it in the chat. If you're still working on step one, you can continue to, put your answers in the chat. I know there are a bunch of people who are still probably mulling over things. So whatever you have, I think, let's start putting it all on the chat so that everybody can kind of respond. Miriam, that's a really great great project sentence, I think.
Yeah, it tells you exactly off the
I know
top,
exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, which is awesome because that's like job done.
How can the market space serve as window into market, women voices, economy, agency, culture?
Wow.
So with this one, this is great. Like, that the first sentence, but I want to know, sorry, I missed one, but I will go back to it, sorry. But I want to now know what market space. I know you mentioned it in your in step one, but if you were to pitch this project to someone as you're riding an elevator, you've gotten exactly a minute to until you reach from floor 1 to floor, let's say 22, and we want you to convey everything that there is to convey about this concept in one sentence. So you want to add certain details. So this is a good one to work with. There's information there, but what is the specific information about market space that you need to add to make that, that hook? How do you hook people into it in a way that's attractive to, in just one sentence, they know that this is very rich, and it's a very rich subject. It's very relevant. It's very complex. You want to give them a taste of that. Again, keywords, the keywords are great. I would also say break them down further into sort of regional or sort of location specific keywords, just to get more people engaged. Then Nasheli says to spark dialogues on the silenced archival stories of marginalized communities who have contributed to the racial histories of academic institutions. That gives us a great idea about what you're trying to do.
Can you be a little more specific about which archival stories? Because what's missing here right now is the location. So the silenced communities, marginalized communities in archives, in academic institutions. So now let's get a little more specific about where are you wanting to, at least in the first episode, where are you wanting to locate that first podcast, if you had to be specific?
So we're out of our 5 minutes, and do you want to go to the next one?
No, you go. It's okay.
We have one more.
And all of this will start to, kind of come together. a lot more as we go through these slides and you start to think more and more. I think it's almost like the tough part of it is done. Like, what is the story going to be? And now it's time to like become more and more specific. So now the next step, am I going to skip? No, okay. I think it's the next one.
No, 7.
Okay. So now you have this idea for a podcast, but that's just one side of the story. Now, who are the listeners that you want to reach out to? Like, who is the audience, whether it's an academic audience or a non-academic audience? Who are the people that you are targeting? Who do you think will want to listen to the podcast? And which audience do you have in mind when you are thinking about your podcast? So let's give 2 minutes. I think 2 minutes.
No, we'll need a little bit longer.
Little bit. Okay. So
I'm just going to put 5 minutes on the clock.
Okay.
So the one way to do this, and this is not the way that NPR prescribes, but you can follow the right-hand column, which says put yourself in the audience's shoes and ask. An easier way to think about that is when you think about someone listening to your podcast, who is that person? What's the demographic? What kind of work are they doing? Where are they listening to your podcast? How are they listening to your podcast? Are they washing dishes and listening to your podcast? Because that listenership is different from someone driving to work and listening to your podcast, which is different from someone taking a walk and listening to your podcast, or just listening to your podcast, right? So when you're defining audience, be very, very specific. And it doesn't have to be one persona. You can develop multiple audience persona. So for example, when we think about Masala History, we tend to think about people who are interested in history, but don't want jargon. So not an academic audience, or are not comfortable with jargon. People who are interested in their own history. So we are looking at South Asian audience. But we are also looking for probably rather youngish audiences. So because a lot of people in South Asia who listen to podcasts are younger. So we are looking for like a 20s and 30s bracket. We are also looking for people who have an English education, because that's our podcast is mostly in English. So it's an English speaking audience, because they are also, if they're South Asian, then they're also urban mostly. So we are talking about a very specific subset of, broad South Asian population as it is categorized. So dive in a little bit deep and take about, maybe the next, let's say 3 to 5 minutes to come up with what your ideal audience is. It can be multiple personas or one persona. Just sort of think through who that is, and then put it in the chat. Three, and then as we talk, we can take 2 more minutes. And then, sorry to interrupt your activities. Use the next worksheet if you want to use that space to play around. You can have main and subordinate audiences. Yeah, if you can imagine a person, I think it makes like it clicks something, I think. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of Yeah, like, podcasting is so easy because you can do it anywhere, anytime. And so about 60 to 70% of podcast listeners are always, this is their second activity, like not their primary activity. So it's always important. Like we talked about sound, right? Like that code switch sound, the music, it's so loud because they probably understand that their audience are probably driving or traveling. And so they can actually go high volume to get attention. And then once you get the attention, then they can lower the volume. And then, yes. They do a lot of audience surveys. So it's very different from us listening to code switch in a room where we're intensely concentrating. And so they are NPR's really marketing to a specific audience, like each of their podcasts.
Oh, wow. This is, Kevin, this project sounds like a really like a long, drawn out project, but it's super interesting.
Road trip travel to be here. Oh, I love it. Kevin, please make the podcast so that I can listen.
I know.
Oh, I want this podcast so bad.
Kevin, how did you come up with this idea? Because it's so interesting. But if you could just share how you came up with this idea for this podcast. And that is something, that podcast, I think, would have an audience interest,
very broad audience listenership. Yeah.
Because I think everyone has that kind of curiosity. Right?
So if you have an audience in mind, I mean, you don't have to, you might have developed multiple personas, but if you have a specific one persona or one main persona in mind, then, just put that in the chat. There it is.
Oh, wow. Okay, can you just because otherwise it just keeps going away. Thank you.
No, the reason is they are also seeing the screen, right?
But it's like it's to everyone anyway.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they keep typing and then
Naturally, that's great. Like, that's a really
well thought out audience.
Yeah. And specifically, like, it's sort of like, it's not an academic audience, but it's quasi-academic audience. And people who, so when you have that kind of, so now that you know that, and we'll do this will be the next exercise Manamee talks about, you kind of know what you can and can't do in that podcast, because you're catering to a very specific audience. Likely people who have some context or background knowledge in that field. Yes, below the boundaries, yes. People with English education, mostly non-academic, African Americans. Great, that's a great one too, where there's a very specific niche that is interested in diasporic studies and diasporic culture, who are not studying this as a profession. That's a good way to look at it. I love this, Kevin. The mile markers, like that's
awesome.
Yeah. People related with academia, faculty, grad students and undergrads, teachers working on high school, people related with education. Yeah. See, again, Miriam, this is, so from Miriam's answer, if you take a look at it, you know that it's basically going to be a niche podcast. It's very different from what Kevin's suggesting, right? Kevin's podcast probably has a very broad appeal. Everybody loves travel. Everybody likes road trips. They want to listen to stories about road trips, and it's a public audience. So that's going to have a broader appeal, whereas Miriam's audience is going to be more niche. It'll be like talking within a certain community. So your audience will also dictate the reach and scope of your the scope of your content, as well as the reach of your podcast. And so, which is why you shouldn't compare podcasts, like, you know, a podcast which is niche with like 2,000 listeners is probably far more successful than a broadly appealing podcast with just 5,000 listeners. So it's important to have that in your mind when you're actually making, because it can be incredibly frustrating when you don't see the audience growth, but you have to be careful about thinking about the relativity factor in making podcasts. People, everyday folks, adults 20 to 50. Yeah. I think 20 to 50 would be a good, like if it's a museum crowd, we could get like, you know, more older members in the crowd. But then in this case, in Will Mary's case, like this will not be appealing to children, right? Museums do have a large, you know, sort of like children related programming. And that podcast with the same material would look very different from what Will Mary is suggesting, because it's to very different demographics in terms of age. So what you will, the same content when made for an older audience versus a younger audience can look very different in terms of its treatment, the way, you know, you talk, the way things are scripted, but also in terms of sounds, like, you know, some certain sounds that you share are going to be like, you can't make a joke about Seinfeld, I'm guessing, to, you know, 10-year-olds or 15-year-olds. I don't know, Seinfeld is on Netflix now, so maybe people know, but you have to be able to connect with them culturally, and how you do that connections through podcasts, through audio, using your voice or your interviewee's voice, it depends on catering to that particular group's cultural connections. So that's important. No, this is great. So we're going to continue working on that. Yeah, go on. I'll move. Yeah. Okay, nitty gritties. Take it away. No.
Okay, so it's just like, okay, back and forth. So it's okay. So now we have thought about what the topic is going to be. Now we've thought about who the audience is going to be. And now, so what is it that you're making? Is it going to be an opinion piece? Is it going to be something has happened? Is it going to be an analytical piece? Is it going to introduce, is there a topic? Because some of these topics, a lot of people wouldn't know about, like these associations that you guys have made, a lot of people, it wouldn't come to them. So are you giving them the introduction to it? And so here again, you have the sheet here with all of these blanks that you can fill out as you're thinking about your project. And I think most of this is kind of like, it's self-explanatory. You can just see it. So the first one is format. What kind of a format would,
sorry, I'm just going to move this to the side.
Okay, what kind of a format is it? Is it just going to be you doing the speaking? Are you going to be bringing in an expert to introduce some of these themes, or is it going to be you having a conversation with someone else? Like all of it, is it going to be in a storytelling form? And then the second one is what might your audience need from your project and why? So what is the void or what is the gap that your podcast will fill for people? So again, going back to some of the Masala history stuff that we did, one of the things, and I think we talked about it in the first session, is the farmers' protest. Everyone was up in arms talking about what was happening in the farmers' protest, but that protest didn't happen one fine day that the farmers are protesting. There was a background, there was a historical background, and that information usually doesn't come out. Nobody really talks about, unless it's an op-ed piece or something, no one really gets into what is the historical legacy. So that was the gap we thought would be a good idea to try and fill. And then again, the third one would be how is your audience going to benefit? Like, are they going to leave the podcast and just say, okay, well, that was fun, and then just move on? What do you want them to take away from it? What are the knowledge things that you want them to take away? The alternatives, what are the alternate ways the audience might get this information? Can they go to Google and just Google this information? Even if they can Google, are they willing to Google? Or would they much rather, have that experience of listening to someone tell them about it? And again, so the fifth one, and this is the one I think a lot of us get stumped on, like, how is yours the best product that is out there? So how is it that you are going to, using your background, how would you provide that advantage to say, hey, come listen to me because I know what I'm talking about? So these are just some of the things, and I think this should probably be more than 5 minutes.
10 minutes.
Yeah. So let's do this for 10 minutes. Let's really think this through. And again, you don't need to have all the ideas all set out, ready to go. But these are things for you to think about as you are giving birth to this podcast episode baby, to think about it from all of these different angles. These are like pretty.
So 10 minutes on the clock, and we can regroup in 10 minutes. So this is the fourth exercise. It's called "What do you think?" in italics you're making.
Miriam, I'm assuming you guys would want to bring in experts to, no, it's cute, no chat, right? Okay. Considering. So the difference between the benefit and need and opportunity is, once again, that's, I think, I mean, at least in my opinion, and I don't know how Deepthi feels about it, is also, I think, subjective, because when we put out a podcast, from our perspective, it's beneficial to whoever listens to it, right? Especially if you're covering a topic, a much more broad-based topic, or a topic that is presently going on, then it's a key benefit, because again, at least I'm going to talk from the historical perspective, that anytime something happens, there's a historical precedence to it. So that's the benefit, that people know about how it happened in the past, what were the results of it. And the need and the opportunity would be that the opportunity is, okay, let's talk about the need. And the need, I think, once again, is kind of the same thing, is the need to put it in a perspective.
Okay. So maybe an example might work. So in the case of Masala History, the need for the audience, that what the audience needs from us is interesting conversations or interesting stories, historical stories. And I'm emphasizing stories there because it's history, but we are going with storytelling. So, it almost appears as stories, right? If you take that as the need or the opportunity to educate people about history, South Asian history, in an entertaining way, if that's the need or the opportunity, then in key benefits, we have to think about that in designing the episodes. So, for example, if we are going to talk about the pandemic, it's an incredibly difficult topic to make it entertaining or interesting. So then we'd have to go back and think about, how can you talk about something, that the history of something that's so relevant to us, that we are living through, and if we can't make it entertaining, or if we can't present it in a way that is appealing, what other benefit are they getting out of it, right? So so at this instance, with this particular topic of the pandemic, maybe the audience do not need entertainment, but what they want, the benefit that they get, is they get to historicize the moment that they're living in. So you're trying to marry two different ways of looking at audience. As Manamee said, the audience need is something we project. The benefit is what they get out of it. We have about 2 minutes left to complete. So if you have some of your answers, you can put that in the chat. Or if as you've been doing these exercises, you have some questions that you'd like to pose at this point, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll keep monitoring. You have about 1 minute and 10 seconds to finish this one. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, most podcasts, I think, use that as a measure. But there are some podcasts that are, I've listened to podcasts that are about, like, you know, sexual violence, trauma survivors. And so it's like almost like a group counseling session, which is not something, I mean, people do that because they get something out of it, but it's definitely not entertainment. So so there are others, but entertainment comes easily because podcasting is social media, right? It is mass media. And so it's very much a part of most of the things that happens in the podcasting realm. All right, so our time is over for this section. Please put in your answers or any questions that you might have in the chat now.
Or in fact, we could just go to the next one because that's like the whole sentence.
Yeah.
So I think this might be better for them to fill out.
Yeah.
In
So,
like one sentence.
Yeah.
Okay,
so we're going to continue this by actually, sorry. Okay. Great. Thank you, Nashili, for that. So here is like a sentence that you can make.
like in a compact way.
It's an exercise we did in like elementary school. Dash, which is your project title, is a dash, which is the format. That dash is the key benefit for dash audience who dash the need or opportunity, unlike dash alternatives, our project dash advantage. So there are two sentences there, and doing the exercise that you did earlier, like complete that sentence in, let's say, 3 minutes.
Up until now, what we have talked about. And I think we should be a little, you know, if you can't fill out the last one, unlike dash alternatives, our project advantage dash, that I think if you can fill out the advantage part, that's fine. If there are no other podcasts who are doing anything similar, then it's fine. But at least this will help you like really now think about it in concrete terms to fill out this sentence.
Okay.
And this will be like the elevator pitch she was talking about.
So this is for 3 minutes. we have about a minute.
So Janice, how many?
No, I'm on.
So how many people did you have registered for this? About like 50 or something?
Rain.
And after, so the seventh one is the one with oh, they can see all this, right?
Just do this.
What was the seventh one that we were missing? Oh, we were going to skip.
The project team thing.
But I think they want to talk to you about it, right?
Yeah. So if you have your sentences, now is the time to put them in the chat. We are going to give you a minute to type it in and see if you want to share it with others. And then once we are done with that, we are going to move to number 6 instead of number 5, because we can do number 5, which is again about audience in the Q&A. So you post your sentences in the chat. Museum Lovers Podcast is a single speaker discussion style podcast that aims to build critical museum visitors and engage curiosity for educated urban adults who would like to learn about museum topics and current issues. Unlike museums, peer-reviewed articles, our project will break down topics, exhibition, and collections for a general audience. That's great, Wilmary. I love that.
Especially the last sentence.
Yeah, I think that last sentence is really
hooks you in.
Yeah,
yeah.
Because I mean, I'm an art historian. I want that. If you read a lot of contemporary art articles, it's very much geared towards like an art history museum specialist audience. So there's definitely space for this. Throughways tells the stories that hide. Oh, I love the name. Throughways tells the stories that hide by the roadside for travelers who wonder what came before. Great. Informed, I'm not going to try the Spanish title. I will butcher it, Miriam. I'm sorry.
I think earlier
she had said about the
information
teaching of science
yes.
in
It's an interview format podcast that gives voice to bilingual scholars to share their experiences, inspire future scholars who belong to a minoritized bilingual community. Unlike other podcasts about minoritized communities, our project focus on academia, a very exclusive community that looks unreachable for some communities. Yeah, no, so that again, the second sentence actually really sets it apart. It kind of tells why this project is relevant and who it's for, and why you are doing this kind of a bilingual podcast. So that's really, really useful. That's great.
I think all of them sound super interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah. So Manamee, do you want to give the overview?
So I think this will probably be the last couple of small exercises that we do, although this will be a little longer one.
Yeah.
This is really like, so this is what happens when we have to plan an episode and then we sit down and then say, okay, episode topic plan. Now what do we do? What's the next step? So I think once we have this done, then when Deepthi does exclusively on the whole technical part of it, then I think you can really think about, okay, I have the conceptual story in mind now, how do we go forward with it? So this will be a little longer exercise. And again, when we do Masala History, we usually have more time So this is, again, by no means do you have to have a concrete answer, but just to kind of like, you've conceptualized it, you know your audience, you know what your pitch is going to be. And so now how do you put it all together? So what is going to be again, going back to the question of what is the episode going to be? What is going to be the premise? Is it to give historical information? Is it an interview? Is it a knowledge-based, someone just speaking about the topic? So that's the first question. Second one, and again, like that's something I think her and she, having more experience than me, has always said that any episode that we do, you usually say under 30 minutes, because it's at that point that, one starts to lose the audience. So do you have enough information? And I think this is the part that both of us kind of love to do, is to research the topic. And usually we end up with more material than 30 minutes. And then it's a question of deciding what do we take out of it. So do you have enough material to ask yourself, and this is obviously not a question that we're going to deal with today. What essential story elements do you need? Do you want to kind of like talk about that a little bit?
So obviously you're not designing a full episode, right? But depending on, I'm just going to pick up some of the examples that's come up, like in the podcast for the women's voices in the market space. For example, that's a place where you can lead with a conflict or a problem, right? So then, your story building starts from that point. So you want to actually bring into, or if you're looking at the road trip travel podcast, that has that can actually be a narrative story. There can be a story arc there. There can be characters, and when you say characters, it's not like in film, in movies. It's just the character is probably the primary podcasting voice, like the host. But you can, within that, play around with the idea of character, or how important characters are to your episode. And it can also be based on settings or locations. So you can pick and choose, just like you would if you were writing a story. Think about the podcast also as a place where you're leading with something, you're focusing on one or two key elements, and then, start with that. One of the things that I'm just going to take the next one also. And then the question 4 is, does this episode have a central question? Can you ask it in one sentence? This is an exercise. Abby Mullen, who is the executive producer for the Consolation Prize podcast that I work on at the center at Mason, says every time we sit down and design an episode for Consolation Prize, she will, at the end of the ideation session, say, what is our focus sentence? And until we have our focus sentence, she won't interview people. She won't interview like scholars as guest speakers. She won't allow us to create a script. No music, nothing. Like, we have to have a focus sentence before we start doing anything else after that ideation sessions. And it's actually been really useful, because then you go back to that focus sentence whenever you feel pulled away, because that can happen with stories, topics as well. And then question 5 and 6, I think.
Yeah, so again, question 5, I mean, how does this episode help fulfill your overall concept? This is, again, going back to what was the aim that you started out with when you conceptualized this podcast? What is that gap, or what is the void that you're trying to fill? So then again, it's about, when you're thinking about how to put the episode together, what are the formats that you have at your disposal that you can use to answer that question? And the overall concept, whether it is building up knowledge, introducing knowledge, filling the gap in the knowledge base, what different formats are you going to use to do that? How are you going to do that? And then how does this episode serve your audience? And this, again, like she said earlier, like Deepthi said, sometimes what happens is we project what we think the audience needs to hear. And many times I think we are right. Sometimes maybe we're not. But it's also about the fact that there is that gap in the audience's knowledge, and the audience isn't aware of the fact that there is a gap. So you are filling a gap for them, whether they are consciously or unconsciously unaware of it. And so should we just do the first part?
So we're going to do a condensed version of this, and you don't have to have, so basically you're just working your muscles, right? Your podcasting muscles and your ideation muscles. So what do you want to do in the next, let's say 15 minutes? Would 15 minutes be too short? If anyone has a 15 to 20, let's say 15 to 20 minutes to do this.
But right now it can still be at like conceptualizing.
Yeah. So we'll take about 15 to 20 minutes, and then you want to look at all these the discussion prompts, and then you want to do a small kind of proof of concept storyboarding. What kind of decide on the topic of the episode, come up with a focus sentence, then think about what kind of experts would you need if it's an interview style or if it's a narrative storytelling style, what kind of readings you would want to do, what kind of contextual information or different kind of voices, even music that you might want to put in. If you're going to get creative, then, do you have creative scripting in it? Of course, you don't need all these things mapped out, but like you want to think about storyboard this episode and what it would look like or what it would sound like when it actually is out. So you also want to think about what kind of script is it scripted or unscripted? If it's scripted, is it tightly scripted narrative, or if it is loosely scripted and you're just talking with bullet points. If it is unscripted, is it conversational? Is it like a stream of consciousness sort of thing? There are podcasts like that. Not that I listen to them, but like there are.
Sorry to interrupt, but sometimes I think we have tried it to just talk to each other, have a discussion without a script, and then we went completely bonkers with it. We started out with topic A. By the time we finished, we were in a whole different planet. So I would say, from my personal experience, it's always better to have some kind of a script or a structure that you follow. Because otherwise, if you're just talking to one of your closest friends and after a point you forget that the microphones exist, then that can be troubling.
And add some alcohol to the mix, and
then you've had
there for the night. So this is something that you want to keep in mind as you're doing this. And also, because Manamee mentioned that, you want to also be cognizant of who you're doing this with. Is this your podcast? You're doing it as a single author? Then that looks different from if you have a friend or a colleague who's working with you. How well do you know your co-host? That makes a difference, because it's very different when it's just the two of us doing an episode on Masala History versus, having like an expert that we invite into the podcast, because the dynamic kind of changes. In PhD,
and I'm sure it looks different for you when you do Masala History with me versus what you do at the center.
So at the center, it's like a professional relationship with all our guests, because we are cold emailing our guests to come on the show. None of us really know most of our guests, so that's a very interview style recording, and I'll show you a clip of it later. But like that kind of dynamic, group dynamic and host dynamic actually makes a difference to the way your episode will sound. So you want to be cognizant of that. And then also, one of the things that you want to think about is your own tone or your own style of presenting. We went through a bunch of different ways of presenting ourselves, and then finally ended it at like, we'll be ourselves, but like a slightly controlled version of ourselves on the podcast, because that is as much as we could manage without really everything collapsing. So you might find like a sweet spot of what kind, and it might take a while, but it's good to think about that from the very beginning. It's also good to think about what it's not about. because you want to keep pulling yourself back to the focus sentence. So what we're going to do in the next 15 minutes is this. You're going to storyboard an episode proof of concept. And then if you have any questions, put it in the chat or the Q&A, and then we will answer it as you're working on it. 15 to 20 minutes. No, yeah.
I hope everyone's doing well. We have about 5 minutes on the clock to do this. If you have questions or you want to put in your sample ideas, you want to share those in the chat, you can do that. 5 more minutes. We have about 2 minutes left. So after this, if you have your, are you still working? Can somebody give me like can we do a temperature check on how everybody is doing in the chat? You can't do thumbs up on the webinar, I think. Yeah, chat you can. Question 3, okay. So this, you're still working on it. Maybe another 5 minutes, right? Do you want more time? If you can just say yes or no in the chat.
Or do they just want to get to all the tech?
Yeah, or we can take a break and then get to the tech stuff. We also have a Q&A, so it's time for Q&A. So depending on interest, we can either take a break, move to the tech, have more time to do what you're doing right now, or do some Q&A.
Okay, how about this? We will take a break now, and then whoever's working can continue to work. And then we will regroup with tech stuff.
We'll regroup, we'll do a recap of what we
Yeah.
are doing now, and then we can go to the tech stuff,
Yeah.
which I think is what most of them.
So we're going to start with somebody in the chat. Okay, great. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a 15-minute break. And then when we come back, we're going to regroup with idea generation. And maybe if you have any questions, we can start with those. But then we're going to move on to talk about tech stuff.
Q&A.
To which... Okay, that's a really great question. We're going to come back to this question after the breaks because we need to take some time to talk about that. So back at 2:45 Central Standard Time. 2:45 is fine, right? Yeah. Okay. Back at 2:45.
Okay, and I did test it.
Yes.
Are you gonna record?
I might just, yeah, I might, depending on time and interest. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So now we're going to move into breakout session 2, which is on podcast tech. There's a Q&A in the chat, and I promise we'll, maybe we should answer this question now. Manamee, do you want to take a stab at this? So we have an anonymous question which says, how can we use podcasting to honor individuals and their stories? Maybe what are some best practices to avoid being extractive when we are asking people to share their stories? Maybe we should take that question now because we'll move into tech. And I want to take a moment to talk about this because it's a very good question, and not just in the context of in which it is asked, context in which it is asked. And so here's my take on it. Podcasting, and there was a question before about paying guests. And in podcasting, at least in the kind of podcasting we do, that's not a practice because guests are actually getting their voices heard.
and their name being published and their work being published as part of coming on your podcast. So that's it's considered like sort of like an exchange relationship. So there is no monetary benefit for the guest to come on a podcast. That's how most podcasts are run, because people who come on have something to present, or they are presenting themselves. So that, but generally you can podcasting and any media production that is not institutionalized, like, if you're at the NPR or at ABC or something like that, there is always an honorarium involved. There is always like, there's a system in place. But when you're doing mom and pop productions, there is always a little bit of an extractive quality to those kind of productions. The best thing that you can do to continue to be sensitive to the people you're recording is to be fully transparent as to what you're going to do with their voices. I also make it a point to always tell our guests that they can have raw audio. We're going to edit and mix their audio. We're going to use it in ways that we want to use for our kind of creative storytelling processes. But we will give them their raw audio that we've recorded, and we'll send it to them if they want. So that's like a service that we're doing for them, where they can take that and do what they want with it, even though I have recorded and I've mixed it, or I have worked in making that audio quality better. Like, it's fine for me to give it back to them. So to make sure that the process of recording and what you're recording and why you're recording it, make that transparent. If it's exceptionally sensitive, I would also say, give them the chance to listen to it so that they can respond instead of being blindsided when something comes out, either pre-production, right after the recording, or post-production if it's a highly produced episode, and to give back. If whatever you have, you want to have co-authorship and allow the guests also to have some amount of ownership to the actual produced track. Manamee, do you want to add anything to that?
Can you just show the question again? To honor individuals and their story. I mean, I think
He covered most of what I would have said, but again, I think you have to be very respectful, careful about people, what they want to share, the boundaries that they want, personal boundaries, what they want to be put out there, careful about the language that you use. If they want their identity to remain anonymous, to make sure, like, go through the script, read through everything carefully to make sure that you're not unconsciously kind of slipping some information that they probably wouldn't appreciate. I mean, at least personally, in Masala History, I don't think we've encountered that problem yet.
I think it's also the kind of genre of podcast that you're doing. When you're doing contemporaneous, like, issues,
or if you're talking to like a victim, like some sexual crime victim or something.
So it depends really on the kind of genre that you're tackling as well. Before we start, like, the tech session, if you have more questions, please feel free to share it with us. We can take a moment to answer it now or as the questions come. But also, those of you who are here online, is there some aspect of is there a technical aspect that you're curious about, that you want to know more about? Because obviously, I'm not going to be teaching you or we're not going to be honing your skills in working with Audacity or another DAW, digital audio workstation in the next 2 hours. It's not happening. So, but I want to make this as useful a session for you as it can be, depending on where you are in the process of learning more about the podcasting as a method. And while you're mulling on your questions, I'm going to show you a few slides about what this process looks like for me as I'm editing Masala History or PhD Futures Now
or Consolation. So if you have questions, technical or otherwise, or are interested in particular aspects, I know we talked about audience engagement, and we'll come back to that at the end. But if you have anything related to sort of content production, producing the content, recording, or producing the actual track and technical aspects of it, please put them in the chat so that I can make sure that I'm getting to those points. And while you are looking at those, kind of mulling over those questions and maybe, posting some of them to me over chat, I want to show you what this process looks like for me. I don't use, so I have, Janet, thank you so much for getting this done. I have recommended Audacity, as I said before. This is what that interface looks like. This is not a very heavy software to downloads, and it's a very basic one, I would say, but it works. It works, and lots of people use it. It's free. It's none of them are really can be called into. It's not as intuitive as the paid ones, but you can still use it, and it's available for PC and Mac users and Linux as well. So it's a very versatile kind of platform, and I will try. I don't know if you want me to go into the nitty-gritties of Audacity. I can. Please put it in the chat if you're interested in that. But I thought it might be easiest to start with what I work with. And yes, I saw. Isabel's question: how long does it take to edit a podcast? If I were to make 15-minute podcast, how many hours could I expect editing to take? So when you say editing, Isabel, I think I'm considering it as post-recording. Everything that happens after you click stop on the record button and you have your guests. If you have guests, you have their conversations recorded, you have your scripts recorded. So I think at that point is where I would say it's editing. It really depends. If you're planning on a 15-minute podcast, great. You're doing yourself a huge service by making a short podcast. It depends on if let me show you something, then it might be easier to explain it this way. So this is the latest PhD Futures Now track that went live earlier last week. It's episode 8, and we are talking about careers for humanities PhDs in the technology sector. And we have our guest was Andrew Keating, who works in Silicon Valley, and he is a tech, like a mid-level director now, but he has a history PhD from UC Berkeley. And so he's talking about his experience, but also giving advice on for those who are interested in doing tech careers. So as you can see, I work with Logic Pro and Logic Pro X, which is the elder sister of GarageBand. GarageBand is the free Mac podcasting, or rather audio editing software, the DAW. And I work with Logic Pro X because I started with GarageBand, so I could, it was easier for me to upgrade. Yes, thank you. But you can also use, if you can buy the software, it's a one-time fees usually. There's Logic Pro X, there's Adobe Audition, which a lot of people use, and there's Pro Tools that a lot of people use. Pro Tools is the most complex one. If you're a beginner podcaster, you don't need Pro Tools at all. But if you plan, it's about how much you want to work with. So this episode is 30 minutes long. We recorded it for our recorded interview was about 50 minutes long. And so I spent about 4 hours editing this down. But I had help. I have the co-host of this episode who helped me edit things, like in terms of the actual portions that we kept and the things that we took out. She helped with that. And then I kind of pulled all that information into Logic Pro X and worked with that. So this is what Logic Pro Workstation looks like. I'm going to show you a bit of this. I'm going to let you listen to a bit of this episode and tell you what you're seeing back into what you're seeing here on the Logic Pro X screen. I'll come back to this in a second. So this is, I think, the first clip. Hold on, let me make sure that you can all listen to it. Share sound.
You know, it may not be a surprise to you or to this audience and our listeners, but humanities PhDs bring a tremendous amount of skills, insights, perspectives, diverse perspectives to whatever they do, whether that's in tech or someplace else. I think that, you know, it's important that we say that explicitly and directly, even if it's something we implicitly realize, because there's so much public discourse out there about having to quantify, you know, the benefits or adopt some sort of, you know, metrics driven, like, here's what your salary is going to be if you're a humanities PhD. And I think that kind of just misses the point. And the point is, you know, to me, humanities education focuses on, you know, we're spending a significant amount of time in making a multi-year, you know, it may not be a surprise.
Okay, so going back to, I think it was Isabel. How long does it take? Yes, how long does it take to produce? It's, sorry, I need to move back. How long does it take to produce that? So in that 1 minute that you listened to Andrew speak, there were about 4 you knows and 2 kind offs. Now, if I decide, like, you know, I'm the kind of producer who does not like you knows and filler words, as they're called, I'm going to spend a lot of my life editing out tracks, depending on how people speak. I personally do a lot of and actuallys in my conversations. And because I know that I do that as filler words, I tend to edit that out. But for most guests, I don't, because I want them to have that natural cadence to their speech. And I want it to sound natural, like, you know, somebody's just speaking to you. So I don't edit out. It's also because it becomes really time consuming. So really the answer to that question is, how much do you actually want to make your life easier in certain ways? And how much of that would affect the content and style of your podcast? And these are personal decisions. If you are, on an average, if you have 15 minutes, if it's a 15-minute podcast, I would say it'll take you about, if it's like a very basic production, then it'll take you about 3 or 4 hours, top to bottom at the beginning. But if it's like a highly produced NPR style narrative storytelling, it could take longer. Now, what you see here in this interface here, that's like your main screen. You'll see on the left, the sidebar, you'll see like a range of, these are where the tracks are. And I have individual tracks created for each thing. So this track is for music. This track is for the podcast intro. This track is for the episode intro. This one is for the host. This one is for the guest. This one is for producer, if I speak. And then this is the episode outro. So this is a very simple podcast. As I told in the very beginning of the morning, you know, I mentioned that PhD Futures Now is much simpler to produce than Masala History or Consolation Prize, the other 2 podcasts I work on, because it's straight, it's like a simple system. But when we start thinking about technically, you're thinking about these DAW software, you want to think about structuring it right from the start. Now in Audacity too, you have the ability to create these templates where you already set these things up on the left side so that these tracks can be pulled in. So when you've recorded and your individual tracks are sitting somewhere, you can just pull them in, basically drag them in to each of these different track levels. And then you edit from within that. Now you see that I have gone a little, you know, anal here with fade ins and fade outs. You don't have to worry about that right now. But in this particular audio, I felt like there was a need to fade the host voice into the guest voice as to make the conversations link together, because it was sounding a little stilted for some reason. So that's what you see, all these little changes to pitches. So what you're seeing here in the yellow line is the actual decibel, the volume level with each one. It stays at 0. You can pull it up or down for the entire track, or you can actually pull down certain parts, as I've seen these V's, me kind of pulling it down to create like a fade-in effect. Professional podcasters at NPR, for example, or radio producers have actually an instrument, an automation instrument, that machine that they use to do this kind of tuning. Since I'm not investing in one, I have to do it manually, and I don't do it often. I can, but it's going to take time. So if there's an interest in it, I can definitely show them how to do it.
Just to kind of with lots of
Yeah.
so that,
Yeah.
I'm not wearing my mask.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we can do that. So this is what a finished version looks like, or a working version of a podcast episode looks like. This one is Adobe Audition. This is a screenshot I took of my executive producer for Consolation Prize, Abby Mullen's desktop while she was working on this episode that's not yet out. So here you'll see that there are a lot of historical figures whose quotes are recorded by someone in our work or one of our colleagues, but they're presenting themselves as a historical character. So you'll see names like Gilmartin, Buchanan, O'Sullivan, because those are all the historical figures who feature as if they are speaking in quotes in this episode. So you will see Abby is the host, Greenberg is our expert scholar, and then Stephen Inskeep is in this. If you are a historian, you kind of know him, I think. He's a fairly well-known historian. And then we have about four historical figures, and then music has not been added. For Consolation Prize, we actually have someone in the music department, a professor in the music department who composes music for our podcast. So all this is sent to him, and then he composes episode-specific music, and then it's mixed in. So yeah, I want you to listen to an episode of Consolation Prize at some point because it sounds different, and I think I included it somewhere. Yeah. This is an episode that I recorded over the summer, but I'm not going to show you that one. I'm going to show you this one. It's called Greener Pastures. This is an episode I produced. It's about this consul, or the first Black consul of the United States, who was posted in Vladivostok, Richard Greener. He was the first Harvard graduate, Black graduate from Harvard University, which was then Harvard College. He was the first law professor in a Southern university. And so this is basically about his life as a consul. I'm going to play a little clip to show you the complexities of different kinds of storytelling.
Every once in a while, someone comes along and says, "That man Greener up in Siberia is all right."
Everywhere throughout the East, I received unfavorable reports of Mr. Greener, our commercial agent at Vladivostok. His habits are said to be extremely bad.
He has represented the United States as consul at Vladivostok with credit to himself and his race.
There was a long article in the Dalny Vostok about this same Mr. Greener, a regular cheap politician's puff, which could have been dictated by no one but himself. Among other things in this article were the facts that he was a close personal friend of both McKinley and Day. He informs everyone he meets that he speaks several languages, and then to back up his statement, he usually drags in some French phrase. He goes swelling around town with a flag about 4 inches long, pinned with an eagle to his waistcoat, and a flag pin in his tie, so of course everybody knows who he is.
I know my own worth, the strength of my pen and my voice, and the character of my determination.
I stumbled across Greener in my teaching at Howard. At one point, one of my colleagues, an older colleague, in looking at my course on Russian history, he said, "Have you ever heard of Richard Greener?" And I said, "No." And he just walked away. And so I went to the library. That's what you're supposed to do in those situations. And the more I looked, the more I found.
Richard Greener lived a life full of contradictions. The more you look at him, the more you find, and the harder it is to understand him. I'm Abby Mullen, and this is Consolation Prize, a podcast about the history of the United States and the world through the eyes of its consuls.
Okay, so this is kind of like an NPR style episode where you get into almost minute 3 and you're still not entirely sure what it is about. Superflex right now are the voice that is Richard Greener's voice in that first 2 minutes is actually the voice of NPR, Chioki Jansen. And so Chioki is voicing Richard Greener. So, Superflex moment for us there that we got Chioki to record for us. But in the first 3 minutes, you'll see that there are 6 different tracks of 6 different people and the music. So there are actually 7 tracks mixed in to create those first 3 minutes of the audio. And that takes time and effort and a lot of finagling, honestly. But it's good to keep that in mind that, complexity, you can do simpler podcasts and you don't really have to do what we're doing in Consolation Prize to actually make a good podcast. So having said that, I want to go back to this and talk a little bit about what these things look like. So anybody has any questions so far? Can we take a minute to kind of check and see if you have any particular questions to ask, anything's come up that's got your interest? Oh, you don't have a Mac? Oh. No, I just need the charger. That's fine. Yeah, my charger's in my bag somewhere. Questions? Anybody? Any questions? Okay, if you don't have any questions, I want to actually use this time to introduce a few things. So I'm going to pull up Audacity. How do I, okay. There we go. Okay. If you have Audacity downloaded already, you can just sort of follow through if you want, or record on your own. I'm going to just record a few, just one track. So if you're recording, you can obviously record on your phone and transfer that track to a DAW system. But you can also record on Zoom and take those tracks. So any MP3 or .wav, the WAV files will work here on most DAWs. So you just take whatever audio track you have, import it here, and then work on it. But in Audacity or in most other platforms, you can actually do direct recording also. So I'm going to click on record here. And I'm going to just talk into my microphone. And I want to basically show you that what kind of sound quality we get. Like I'm using this lapel mic, and I am hoping to get some audio. So let's see, I have recorded about 25 seconds of me speaking. And this is what that looks like. Now, when you get these two, it shows up like in two bars with like a left and a right. If you look at the left side, that means it's in stereo mode. Now, stereo mode is what you have, and you can hear the stereo mode is when you record and your voice is captured in two different subtracks so that you can pan left and right. When in podcasts, we usually do mono recording. So, you can go in and change stereo to mono if you need to do that.
What would be the benefit?
There is really stereo is hard. Mono kind of makes things simpler. And if you're really having only one person speaking track, you don't need stereo. Stereo is for dramatic effect. It actually increases the size of your audio file as well. And so it kind of pans. So I'll show you, if we have time, I'll show you what the difference is. But essentially, this is a stereo track, and I'm going to keep it. I can go in and take this and make it into a mono track, and they've split into two mono tracks, right? And now I can go in and basically delete this. And that way I get, oh, it's not deleting. Maybe it's, there we go. So I can go delete tracks. So this track, which I have here, I'm going to play it for you once. And I'm going to just talk into my microphone, and I want to basically show you that what kind of sound quality we get. Like I'm using this. Okay, so that's me talking, as you can see, and you'll see that this microphone is doing a good job of capturing audio. When I play this thing, oh, sorry about this. Let me just hide it. Yeah. I want you to pay attention to this level here. This is where how loud this track is being registered. So when I hit play, so notice how the green goes up and down. About 25 seconds of this level. This level is actually called your audio levels, and usually for speaking voices, it's -12 is about the average. So as long as it's hitting -12 while you're speaking, I'm sorry. So you're good. I have recorded about. Now I'm not going to try and yell because I don't want your ears to suffer, but like it can. The idea is you always have to bring your voice levels down to around that -12 dB decibel levels. That's the first part of the podcasting. Now you'll see that I have also a lot of spaces in between my speech. You can see that here, there, right? By the size of these little knobs, you can see that I'm louder here, but I'm almost muttering here in a way. And then there is the space in between. So if I want to cut out the spaces, or like, what I do is I hit delete. Just drag and delete. So now if you listen to this, I am hoping to get some audio. So let's see, I have recorded. So then it sped up my speech, right? But it also makes it seem a little bit unnatural because I've cut it off at wrong ends. Now, the one thing that you want to look out for, two things that you want to look out for in any audio track when you first start recording is what is the bed. So in my case, there's no bed here, because bed is if there is no noise. Let me try and record and show you that. If there is no noise at all, if you're not speaking, what other ambient noises are being caught in the recording? So I'm going to be silent for a second. So let's see, I have recorded about, sorry about that, wrong space. Come on.
Okay. Now, listen carefully. I don't have headphones, and this is why you always wear headphones. I can't hear any bed voice. I can see minor fluctuations here within that line, the bass line. So there's some whirring noise or something to my bed, but it's not anything that's like, high or like that will affect my voice or my audio quality. So you look out for bed, and then the next thing that you look out for is called clipping. And clipping is, I will apologize now for if this becomes too loud. I'm still not loud enough, but what happens is you see the change in this in the graphic, right? These look like there's something happening. So clipping is when you're too loud and the ends of these graphs hit the top and bottom bars. And that means it is too loud. And not only is it too loud, it's too jarring. So this most commonly happens when you have plosives, your P sounds like PBS. When you do that, there's a sound that explodes out of your mouth with too much when too much oxygen comes out. And those clipping can be really like, it'll pop in your ear, in your listener's ear. So the two things that you have to look out for when you're recording is clipping and bed level noise. And there are ways in which you can, like, the bed can be worked on. There are ways in which you can bring the bed down. But clipping is a big problem. So that is why you use a pop filter whenever you're recording. So this is sort of the basics of recording on Audacity or any other DAW. There is not much to it. You can also record, as I said, in Audacity on mono or on stereo. Sorry. Any questions? If you have questions or concerns. Yeah. Okay. Questions? I can keep talking about this forever. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to actually do, which I don't think I have over here, is to make everyone's lives easier. I have a playlist of tutorials that I did not make, but like I have sourced from YouTube, where they have pretty good tutorials about how to make an edit on Audacity. And so I will share that resource list with Carla and Janet, and then they can share it with you. And so all these things that I'm talking about and more are there in those tutorials. And if you are going to be a self-taught producer, a podcast producer, then YouTube is like a really good source to go and get your information from, because there's plenty of people doing tutorials on Audacity, Logic Pro, Adobe Audition, and the like. And so that is how I learned a lot, but like a lot of this by myself, and it takes time. So the best thing that you can do for yourself when you're producing a podcast or producing any audio is to make that the audio quality at the beginning is the best that can be. Under, I know there are restrictions when it comes to the kind of equipment you have or where you record and the like, but like under whatever circumstances you have, what is the best quality audio that you can record? And once you have that, it just becomes easier to do this kind of production within the DAW. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what Manamee was asking me to mention earlier. So Janet's question was like, how do you coordinate when you're not in the same room? We do always have a video function. We record with video on. So even if we are, we record on Squadcast, and Squadcast has a video option. So they don't record the video, they only record the audio for you, because then you get a higher quality audio, but like you can see each other. And so we have cues. So if we bungle something up, we kind of do timeout and then say count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then start again, so that we can have a pause, so that when I go into editing, I can edit out. There's enough pause for me to cut that piece out and start from afresh. So that kind of coordination is what will be required if you're not virtually in the same place. So we do have some hand gestures and movements that we kind of now are used to. Yeah, and we use the chat, but the chat again is a tricky one, because sometimes chatting, texting, typing makes the noise that your mic picks up. So that's not preferred. Hand gestures are more preferable, or even like voice is more preferable, because at least the voice you can actually cut and take out pieces of the track. If the guest is speaking and it's something really important, and at the same time the guest is texting you about something that's happening, then all that really good audio is going to be tarnished by the sound of the clickety clack of the laptop. So so those kind of details, and of course those kind of details differ depending on what kind of equipment you have, where you're recording, what's your ambient noise level, what's the level of recording of the voice that you're doing at your end. So all those things come into play. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. That's basically, if this was Logic Pro, I would have shown it already. It's just I'm not used to Audacity, so I need to actually look at where those options are. But basically, you use the import function and do audio, and we don't have any audio on this desktop for me to import. If it was on my computer, I had it set up. So you go to wherever your file is. Is there anything that I can import here? Libraries, music, anything? Nothing. So so basically, wherever it is stored, it's like opening a PDF. You just click open, and it'll open in the track that you've selected. So you can create a new track, add new track, decide mono or stereo track, and then make sure that track is highlighted. You'll know that that's the yellow box, and then you go and then you click import, and you click the options. If you click on audio, I think you can only import like MP3 files. So if you look at raw data, you can probably do .aiff or .wav files. You'll have to play around with that. And basically, you can pull this here. Now, you can also choose to pull it at certain time limits. If you see this bar here on top, that bar is actually where you see the time. Like, you can see this is the 28-second mark. And then if you pull it, you'll see that this audio ends at the sort of 39.5-second mark. And so you can actually place, your cursor here and make sure that's where you insert your clip. So right track and the right time to add clips. And this is how you do any, not just music, but like any clips that you add. This is how you import and add clips. Any questions, concerns, problems?
I'm also going to talk about two more technical terms because those are important. I mean, there are more technical terms, but like I am going to only talk about two more. Just going to get that out of the way. I'm going to take this track. And I'm going to, there are two things that you have to know of. One is normalize, which is basically saying that whatever is the value, the decibel value you give here, that's the highest value, or that is that your volume will get to. So say I set this to minus, I don't know why this is not working, minus 6 dB, then anything that I've spoken in this track that has gone above that minus 6 decibel, that will be brought down to the minus 6 level. So say you have to preview this to get an example. So you see that that's the noise that I recorded earlier. Minus 6 is over here, so it's really high. Now watch what happens when I pull this down to minus 48. You hear that? That it dampened the entire, it brought down the amplitude, so you can't really hear that sound anymore. So say I had a double track and I had one guest saying something important, but the other guest made this noise. I can go into the other guest track and then normalize to bring down their volume levels so that they don't interfere with the actual important guest, the track, the important part of what the other guest was saying. That was confusing, but I hope you got that. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so Manamee's question is, what happens if one guest is loud and the other person is quieter? This is the next thing that you want to know. There's a thing called gain. Where I'd have to move this out. If you go into effect and you look through, there is, I don't see it here. There should be, it might be different here, but like basically you can go to an individual track and you can increase or decrease the gain here. Yeah, the gain is here on the left hand corner on Audacity. So you can click gain on each individual track and increase or decrease the overall volume of each track so that you can kind of equalize as you're recording. I would recommend doing testing before you actually record the episode, and adjusting gain before you start recording, because it's not ideal to start to kind of do the gain adjustment after you record. So these are the few things that you can actually do really quickly to make sure that it's not too loud, there's no clipping, and there is no the bed noise is controlled from the very beginning. Any questions, concerns, problems? I think. Yeah, so I do fade in and fade out, but I manually do them, and I can't show them to you in Audacity, but like I do fade in and fade out manually. But I also do EQ. That's sort of like a, I'll try and show you EQ here. Let's hope. Where's the EQ? I think. There we go. So this looks slightly different from what I'm used to because I work with Logic Pro X, as I mentioned earlier. But basically, let me just pick the graphic EQ. Basically, this is when you start speaking, you'll see the preview now. Okay, that bit did not have any. Just give me 1 second. There we go. And I'm going to just talk into my microphone, and I want. So this is a clean audio, and you don't really, you won't really hear this much. But what we're doing with EQ, when we are talking at different hertz, right? Like our voice modulation, it's a different bandwidth. And what this tells you is this is exactly at the median level, but you can actually change. So if it's a female voice, it's going to be, we're going to be loudest around 400 to 1000 kilohertz level. Male voices tend to be more dominant around here and there. And so, and then if there are sort of like machine whirring noises, those are found somewhere in here. So by reducing these things, so if I reduce all these levels, all these, reduce this down, like EQ it down, then you're not going to, if there is any machine noises, they get cut. So that's one way to, and this is, again, if you are using Logic Pro X, this is more intuitive. That's where these paid DAWs are more intuitive because they kind of show the curves of as you're speaking. And so you can actually see it getting reduced, and you don't have to do this in this form. But essentially what you're doing is you are using equalization, EQ, to bring down sounds that you don't want heard and amplify the parts of your voice that you want heard. So those are the two things that you can do with EQ. To actually, when you start podcasting, these are the only things that you really need. And you don't have to really worry about all the other various things that you see in the effects section. I think, do you need, I think that's like the basics of, yeah. Yeah, Zoom's a preferred way to do it now because everybody uses Zoom. This less things go wrong when you're on Zoom because everybody knows how to handle it. We use something called Squadcast, which is a paid recording platform, and Squadcast does not record video, although you can see the other person. And then Squadcast stores them in iCloud for you and then lets you download individual tracks later. And so there are many softwares like that out there. There's a thing called Zencaster, which is slightly cheaper than Squadcast. All these are different options. And again, none of them are 100%. Yeah, I think that was more Wi-Fi trouble than Squadcast trouble. So all of them require like a very strong Wi-Fi connection. So more than the platform, it's the internet connection that usually plays the villain.
Yes, so you record on Squadcast, you download the MP3s or the .wav files, you store them in a place, and then you import it into Audacity. And that's how you would, usually I think everybody's moved into online, not many people are doing in person anymore. So I think that's the modus operandi for almost everybody now. Yeah, so once you, now these are like, you see multiple tracks here. When you're ready to export, you can just click on export and you can export as one of these file groups, usually MP3 is the smallest. And you basically save it. I'm going to just do UIC podcast. And here we haven't really done much, so you'll just hear the same podcast, the track that we just heard, but like you can also add metadata and things like that to your, and then you can just basically have one audio file with multiple recordings that's all mixed in. And that's the thing that you will then host on a podcasting platform. So basically Audacity acts as a place where you take in all the tracks that you want to mix, you mix, and then you work on the quality and the edits, and then you export it out as a single file. So onto a platform, usually a podcast hosting platform is separate from iTunes. There's a bunch of them now called Buzzsprout and Podbean and Spreaker, and like there are a bunch of them. We use Blueberry for Masala History. I use Buzzsprout for PhD Futures now. They're all good in various ways. They're paid. The only unpaid one is Anchor, which also lets you directly publish onto Apple Podcasts. But what the podcast hosting platform does is it will keep your, it's like an iCloud storage, but you can also connect it to Apple Podcasts and Google Music and all these larger, Spotify and all these larger units. And they will, whenever you publish something, they will push it out to all these listening platforms without you having to do the additional work of going and doing it. At the same time, they will give you an embed link that you can take, pull and put on your website. And so you can have, you don't always have to go to the podcast hosting platform to listen. You can listen to your podcast on your website. So it's really like a hosting unit where the podcast resides, but then it's kind of then pushed through RSS feeds to all these other places where you can actually listen. Anchor does that, yes. So we can end early if nobody has any questions. Yeah. What do you think, Janet? Yeah. Do you have any questions? Yeah. So thank you so much for hosting us. This was fun. Should I stop sharing? Yeah, okay. Okay.
Thank you, virtual audience and live audience, for being here today on this blustery day. We appreciate you. And thank you so much to our two podcasts.
Thank you. It was fun.
Yeah, it was fun. Oh.
Well, sorry. Yes, Zara, I will send the link through Carla or Janet. We'll send the link. Yes, I will also send a set of resources along with it. So please be on the lookout for it tomorrow. Please be on the lookout for it tomorrow. Sorry, I looked at this than the camera, but like, yes, thank you for your questions and your participation. And I will send the resources, including the YouTube tutorials tomorrow. Carla, are we done? Okay, we're done. Bye. Bye. Thank you, everyone.